Hey guys, tonight we're stepping through the heavy doors of a Victorian hospital where the smell of carbolic acid fights a losing battle against everything else, where surgery means screaming, where nursing meant something very different than it does today, and where your chances of survival sometimes decreased the moment you checked in. If you've ever complained about hospital food or waiting rooms, wait until you hear about wards where sawdust soaked up fluids that are better left unnamed, and where the doctor's best tool was often just blind hope wrapped in a confident handshake. Before you settle in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you actually want more of this sort of thing. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and whether you've ever had to stay in a hospital overnight. I read them all, mostly because insomnia is a gift that keeps on giving. Now, dim those lights, maybe grab a warm drink, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture yourself in London, 1850, where the fog isn't just outside, it's crept into the hospital wards too, mingling with coal smoke and the faint sweetness of decay that no amount of lime washing can quite eliminate. You wake up on a narrow iron bedstead in a ward that stretches longer than you can see clearly through the dim gaslight. The ceiling is high, cathedraly high, as if the architects believed that illness needed extra space to rise and dissipate like steam. It doesn't work. The air is thick with the competing fragrances of humanity at its most vulnerable. Unwashed bodies, chamber pots that need emptying, infected wounds weeping through bandages, and the carbolic acid that nurses splash about with evangelical fervor. Welcome to the Victorian hospital ward. If you're here, you're either desperately poor or desperately unlucky. The respectable middle classes still treat hospitals with the suspicion usually reserved for prisons, and they're not entirely wrong. These institutions began their lives as charitable enterprises for the deserving poor, those unfortunate souls who couldn't afford a doctor's house call but hadn't yet descended into the moral abyss of the workhouse. The very word hospital carries a whiff of charity about it, derived from the Latin hospice, meaning both host and guest. You are definitely a guest here, though the welcome mat is theoretical. Let me paint you a proper picture. The ward houses perhaps 40 beds, arranged in neat rows like soldiers on parade. Each bed is separated from its neighbor by approximately 3 feet, just enough space for a nurse to squeeze through with a basin, or for a doctor to stand while making his pronouncements. Privacy is a concept that belongs to the paying classes. Here, your illness is a public affair. The lady in the bed next to you is dying of consumption, and she's been coughing wetly for 3 days straight. Across the aisle, a man with a crushed leg obtained in a factory accident moans softly in a morphine haze. Down the row, someone is crying, whether from pain, fear, or simply exhaustion, you cannot tell. The beds themselves are technological marvels of their time. Sort of. Iron frames prevent bed bugs from having easy highways into the mattress, which is usually stuffed with horsehair or flock, basically whatever fiber was cheapest when the hospital last had its bedding budget approved. Some progressive hospitals have started using wire mesh mattress supports, which are easier to clean and less likely to harbor the various livestock that seem to find hospital beds irresistibly homey. The sheets are coarse linen, washed in scalding water and lye soap until they've achieved the texture of friendly sandpaper. They're changed, hopefully, once a week, or more frequently if you've had the poor manners to bleed or leak extensively on them. Joke 1. The hospital laundry operates on a simple principle. If it's still roughly sheet-shaped after boiling, it goes back into circulation. If it has achieved sentience, it's promoted to blanket. Above your head hangs a card with your name, age, and diagnosis, written in a clerk's careful copperplate. Fever is popular. So is debility. The Victorians love a good vague diagnosis that could mean almost anything. Sometimes the card includes your occupation, because in the Victorian medical mind, what you do for a living is almost as important as what's actually wrong with you. Factory workers get different treatment assumptions than governesses, who get different treatment than seamstresses. The ward's architecture tells its own story. Those high ceilings aren't just for show, they're part of the prevailing theory about miasma, the poisonous vapors believed to cause disease. The idea is that bad air rises, so if you give it plenty of room to rise into, maybe it will float away before it can kill anyone else. Windows run along one wall, tall and narrow, usually propped open even in winter because Florence Nightingale, we'll meet her properly later, has convinced the medical establishment that fresh air is basically liquid health. This means the ward is frequently freezing, but at least the freezing air is moving. Main steam fact. The miasma theory, the belief that diseases were caused by bad air from rotting organic matter, dominated medical thinking until the 1880s, when germ theory finally gained acceptance. This meant that Victorian hospitals were designed for ventilation first, with enormous windows and high ceilings to disperse the supposedly toxic fumes. The nursing station sits at one end of the ward, a tall desk where the ward sister presides like a generally benevolent dictator. She's probably in her 40s, dressed in a uniform that varies depending on which hospital you're in, but generally involves a lot of white apron, a cap that announces her rank, and an expression that suggests she's seen everything twice and wasn't impressed the first time. Behind her, shelves hold the ward's supplies, bandages rolled with military precision, bottles of medicines with alarming names like Black Draught and Godfrey's Cordial, basins, cups, and the mysterious medical instruments that emerge during the doctor's rounds. Speaking of which, the doctor arrives, with the regularity of tide and the pomp of a minor royal. He's accompanied by an entourage, medical students clutching notebooks, a house surgeon trying to look knowledgeable, and perhaps a senior nurse to supply information he's too important to have memorized himself. He moves from bed to bed, and the ward falls into a hush. That's part respect, part terror. Medicine in the Victorian era is still as much art as science, and the art in question is often improvisation theater. He reaches your bed. You've been admitted for, let's say, a badly infected wound from a factory accident. The doctor pulls back your bandage with the confidence of someone who owns very good soap and never has to do his own washing. He prods the wound. You try not to scream because screaming is considered somewhat lower class. He makes thoughtful humming noises. "Laudable pus," he announces to his students, pointing at the yellow discharge oozing from your injury. Quirky tidbit, laudable pus was actually considered a good sign by many Victorian doctors. They believed that thick, whitish pus meant the body was successfully expelling disease. The concept of bacterial infection was still taking root, so doctors actively encouraged wounds to suppurate, thinking it was part of the healing process. They were tragically very wrong. The doctor prescribes a poultice, probably made of bread, milk, and perhaps some charcoal if you're lucky. The wound will be bandaged again, and you'll be told to rest and pray, though not necessarily in that order. If you develop a fever, you might be bled, or given calomel, which is mercury chloride, which will make you drool impressively and possibly lose your teeth, but which is considered a cornerstone of proper medical treatment. Meal times in the ward are events that inspire more dread than anticipation. Breakfast arrives on a trolley pushed by an orderly whose main qualification seems to be the ability to navigate around prostrate bodies without tripping. You receive thin gruel, or spoon meat, which is basically gruel with delusions of grandeur, a slice of bread that might have been fresh sometime in the recent past, and tea that's more concept than beverage. The tea is weak enough to see through, sweetened with a sugar allowance that wouldn't satisfy a cautious ant, and served lukewarm because the kitchen is approximately a mile away through drafty corridors. Joke 2. Hospital tea is prepared by showing hot water a picture of tea leaves from across the room and asking it to do its best impression. Dinner, the main meal served at midday, is more substantial. You might receive beef tea, which is exactly what it sounds like, beef boiled in water until the water admits defeat and takes on a meat-flavored personality. More bread, possibly some boiled vegetables that have been cooked to the point where they've forgotten their original species, and if it's Sunday, or you've been especially good, a small portion of actual solid meat. The meat is frequently mutton because mutton is cheap and apparently thought to be therapeutic. Supper returns to the minimalist theme. Bread, butter if you're lucky, more tea, and perhaps some bread pudding made from the week's accumulated stale crusts. The Victorians firmly believed that invalids should not be overstimulated by rich food, so hospital cuisine aims for what we might call aggressively bland. Flavor is apparently unhealthy. Your taste buds are instructed to endure this philosophically. The ward's daily rhythm follows a pattern that would please any drill sergeant. Patients are awakened at 6 a.m. regardless of whether they've slept, which many haven't, due to pain, fear, or the gentleman 3 beds down who snores like a steam engine with authority issues.
Washing happens at the bedside. Nurses bring basins of water and expect you to manage what you can, though they'll help those who genuinely can't manage. The water is frequently cold by the time it reaches you because, again, the kitchen is very far away and pipework is still something of a luxury. Bedpans and urinals make their rounds. Privacy, remember, is not a thing here. You develop a philosophical attitude toward bodily functions very quickly, or you develop anxiety that expresses itself in extremely inconvenient ways. The windows are thrown open, yes, even in January, and the ward is subjected to what Florence Nightingale calls purification by fresh air, and what you call hypothermia prevention exercise. Doctors' rounds happen in the late morning. This is when the real theater begins. After the medical entourage has swept through like a particularly educated storm, the ward settles into its afternoon routine. Visitors are allowed for precisely 2 hours, usually in the afternoon. They must be quiet. They must not bring food without permission, though many sneak it in anyway, because have you tasted hospital food? And they must not upset the patients or the nurses, which they manage to do with impressive regularity. Between visiting hours and evening, the ward exists in a strange twilight state. Those who can read do so, sharing books and newspapers that circulate like currency. Those who can't read, and literacy is far from universal, talk quietly, play cards if the nurses aren't looking, or simply stare at the ceiling and contemplate life's mysteries, such as whether they'll leave this place walking or in a coffin. Quirky tidbit. Some hospitals employed what we might call readers, usually charitable ladies who would come and read aloud to patients from improving literature. The Bible was popular, as were moral tales about people who worked hard and died virtuously. You rarely got Robinson Crusoe, but you could hope. Night is when the ward becomes truly eerie. The gas lights are turned down to save money and to encourage sleep, which is optimistic given the pain, fear, and snoring. Nurses walk the wards with candles or small lamps, checking on patients, administering nighttime doses of medicine, and trying to comfort those who are dying, which happens with a frequency that everyone pretends is normal because what else can you do? Death in the ward is managed with as much discretion as possible. When someone dies, and someone is always dying, screens are quickly erected around the bed. The body is prepared by the night nurses, wrapped in a sheet, and removed before the morning rounds if possible. The bed is stripped, the mattress flipped, because one side being contaminated with death is no reason to waste a perfectly good mattress. And by breakfast time, there's a new patient in that space, often unaware they're sleeping where someone departed this life just hours ago. Joke 3. The hospital's unofficial motto is "the bed is never empty long," which is efficient but does raise questions about the turnover rate that no one really wants to answer. Infections spread through Victorian hospital wards like gossip through a village. Despite all the carbolic acid and whitewash, despite the open windows and the high ceilings, diseases pass from patient to patient with cheerful efficiency. Erysipelas, a streptococcal skin infection, is so common it's called the surgical disease. Hospital gangrene, a particularly nasty infection that causes tissue to rot and die, claims limbs and lives with distressing regularity. Puerperal fever kills new mothers in the lying-in wards. Pyemia, septicemia, and a host of other emias stalk the corridors like invisible predators.
The problem, though no one fully understands it yet, is that the same doctors and nurses who handle infected wounds, assist at autopsies, and tend to fever patients then move from bed to bed, patient to patient, carrying microscopic passengers that won't be fully understood for another few decades. Ignaz Semmelweis in Vienna has already proven that hand-washing in chlorinated lime solution drastically reduces mortality rates, but his ideas are considered weird and insulting. Doctors clean their hands like common laborers? Preposterous! And it will take Joseph Lister's antiseptic practices in the 1860s before British hospitals really start to get the message. Mainstream fact. Hospital mortality rates in the Victorian era were staggeringly high. Some surgical wards saw death rates of 40 to 50% from post-operative infections alone. The phrase hospitalism was coined to describe the collection of infections that seemed to breed in hospital environments. It wasn't until antiseptic and later aseptic techniques were adopted that these rates began to fall dramatically. But we're still in our ward, settling in for your stay. Let's talk about what you'll see, hear, and smell over the coming days, because sensory experience is what makes Victorian hospital life so memorable, in the way that being hit by a train is memorable. The sounds. Constant coughing from the consumption ward next door, moaning, some of it morphine-softened, some raw and desperate, the clatter of trolleys on bare floors, nurses' footsteps. You learn to distinguish between the brisk walk of efficiency and the hurried pace of emergency. Doctors' voices during rounds, usually pitched to carry because making patients strain to hear their diagnosis seems unnecessarily cruel even by Victorian standards. At night, crying, so much crying, and prayer, whispered or spoken aloud, because in a Victorian hospital, God is both the first and last resort. The smells. We started with this, but it bears repeating, because smell is the sense most associated with Victorian hospital memories. Carbolic acid, phenol, which smells medicinal and sharp and burns the nose. Human waste, because plumbing is primitive and accidents happen. Infected wounds, which smell sweet and rotten simultaneously. Gangrene, which smells like death, because it is death. Soap, harsh lye soap used on everything. Blood, which has a metallic scent that lingers. Bodies that haven't been washed properly in days or weeks. Medicines. Laudanum smells faintly sweet, calomel like nothing much, but various poultices and ointments contribute their own symphony of organic decay and dubious ingredients. And underneath it all, fear. You can't actually smell fear, but if you could, it would smell like a Victorian hospital ward. The sights. Bandages yellowed with seepage, skin flushed with fever or gray with oncoming death, the particular pallor of blood loss, surgical instruments gleaming on trays, bottles and bottles of medicines, their labels promising miracles and frequently delivering nothing of the sort. Religious prints on the walls, Jesus suffering, which is supposed to be comforting in a you think you have it bad sort of way. Nurses in their uniforms, moving with purpose. Doctors in their dark coats, moving with authority. Quirky tidbit. Some hospitals experimented with colored wards, painting different wards different colors to aid wayfinding and supposedly influence patient morale. Blue was considered calming, red energizing, which seems counterintuitive for a hospital. Green restful. Most hospitals stuck with white or cream because paint was expensive and optimism was free. Your fellow patients become your temporary family, united by geography and misfortune. There's the old soldier with the chronic ulcer who's been in and out so many times he knows all the nurses' names and birthdays. The young mother recovering from a difficult birth, trying not to cry when she thinks about the baby who didn't survive. The factory worker missing 3 fingers. The clerk with typhoid fever. The seamstress with consumption who still somehow manages to be cheerful, coughing blood into her handkerchief while discussing the weather. These people will witness your suffering, and you will witness theirs. There's an intimacy to shared misery that's uncomfortable and oddly comforting simultaneously. You'll learn who snores, who prays out loud, who needs help reaching the bedpan in the night, who gets the most visitors, and who gets none. You'll celebrate when someone improves enough to be discharged, and you'll pretend not to notice when someone's condition deteriorates past the point of recovery. The ward sister, that stern woman at the nursing station, will become the most important person in your world. She decides when you get your medicine, whether you're well enough to sit up, if you can have an extra blanket, and whether your visitor can stay 5 minutes longer. Cross her, and life becomes difficult. Win her approval, she might sneak you an extra cup of tea or turn a blind eye when your brother sneaks in contraband cake. Her nurses, usually young women from working-class backgrounds, the respectable middle-class girls haven't discovered nursing as a suitable profession yet. That's coming. Work 12-hour shifts that frequently stretch longer. They're on their feet most of that time, hauling water, emptying bedpans, changing bandages, washing patients, serving food, dispensing medicine, and trying to provide comfort when medical treatment has reached its limits. They're paid very little, often less than a factory worker, and their reputation is, shall we say, variable. Mainstream fact. Before Nightingale's reforms in the late 1850s and beyond, hospital nurses were often former patients themselves, women who had nowhere else to go, or working-class women who needed any job they could get. They were untrained, frequently drunk, hospital beer rations were standard, and extra beer could be purchased, and generally treated as menial laborers rather than skilled practitioners. The stereotype of Sari Gamp, Charles Dickens' drunken, incompetent nurse character from Martin Chuzzlewit, wasn't entirely unfair. But things are changing, slowly. Training schools are being established, standards are being set, nursing is becoming a profession rather than just a job. But in your ward in 1850, you might get lucky and have a nurse who's genuinely kind and reasonably competent, or you might get someone who views you as an obstacle between her and the end of her shift.
As evening approaches, the gaslight creates shadows that seem to move independently. Nurses make their final rounds before the night staff takes over. Medicine is dispensed, laudanum for pain, various tonics and draughts for everything else, all measured carefully and recorded in a ledger, because morphine addiction is already a recognized problem, and hospitals are supposed to track their opiate usage. They don't always succeed, but they're supposed to try. Supper arrives and is consumed with the enthusiasm of people who have learned that complaining doesn't improve the food, but does annoy the nurses. The ward settles into its nighttime rhythm, some patients sleeping, some lying awake in pain or fear, some talking quietly with neighbors, all aware that tomorrow might bring improvement or deterioration or death, and there's very little they can do to influence which. You lie in your narrow iron bed, listening to 40 other people breathe, cough, snore, and pray, and you think about how strange it is to be so completely surrounded by people and yet feel so fundamentally alone. The wound in your leg throbs despite the poultice. You wonder if it's healing or getting worse. You won't know until the doctor's rounds tomorrow, and even then, his cheerful confidence might be masking complete uncertainty. Joke 4. Victorian medical confidence is inversely proportional to Victorian medical knowledge, which creates a fascinating dynamic where doctors are absolutely certain about treatments that are absolutely useless. This is the Victorian hospital ward. It's not the worst place you could be. That would be the workhouse infirmary, where they can't even pretend there's a difference between medical care and warehousing the poor until they die. But it's not exactly where you'd choose to spend your time if you had literally any other option. Tomorrow, the doctors will come and will learn about what they actually do to patients beyond looking confident and prescribing poultices. But for now, settle into your uncomfortable bed, breathe the carbolic-scented air, and try to sleep despite the symphony of suffering around you. Welcome to Victorian medicine. It's going to be a rough night. Section 2. Surgery, from screaming to sleeping. Morning arrives with its usual lack of consideration for whether you're ready. You've survived your first night in the hospital ward, which is honestly an achievement worth celebrating, though the nurses are too busy to notice, and the doctors wouldn't consider it remarkable. But today is special. Today is your surgery day. That infected leg wound we mentioned, it's not improving, and the surgeon has decided that amputation is necessary. Try not to panic. Everyone else is. Let's step back a moment and talk about surgery before we get to your specific predicament. Victorian surgery exists in two distinct eras, helpfully divided by a single word: anesthesia. Before anesthesia, surgery was literally hell on earth. After anesthesia, it was only figuratively hell on earth, which is progress. We're going to start before, because understanding what came before makes you appreciate what came after, assuming you don't faint first. Pre-anesthesia surgery, let's say early 1840s, is a practice that requires three main qualities in a surgeon: speed, strength, and the ability to ignore screaming. The patient is typically conscious for the entire procedure, held down by several strong assistants while the surgeon works as fast as humanly possible. The assumption is that the less time you spend cutting into someone, the less they suffer and the less likely they are to die of shock. This is not a wrong assumption. Imagine, if you will, being that patient. You're strapped to a wooden table in a room that smells like an abattoir with pretensions. The surgeon stands before you in his regular clothes, no sterile gown, no mask, just his everyday wear, possibly with a dirty apron tied over it. His instruments are laid out on a side table: knives, saws, forceps, and needles. They've been wiped clean since the last surgery, more or less. Quirky tidbit: surgeons prided themselves on their gore-stained coats. A coat stiff with old blood was a badge of honor, proof of a busy practice. The idea that invisible organisms might be breeding in those crusty sleeves wouldn't gain traction for another few decades. Some surgeons kept their suture threads pre-threaded in their lapels or even in their mouths for quick access. The phrase "taking up a thread" was literal and horrifying. The surgeon might offer you a leather strap to bite on, or a bullet, hence bite the bullet, or a hefty dose of alcohol, or opium if you're lucky and they have it available. These things help, sort of. Like having a pillow helps when someone is hitting you with a chair. Technically accurate, but not addressing the main problem. The surgery begins. Let's use an amputation as our example, because they were common, relatively straightforward, and absolutely nightmarish. The surgeon makes his first incision through the skin and muscle of your thigh, cutting in a circular motion around the leg. You scream. Everyone expects this. The assistants hold you tighter. The surgeon continues, working through layers of tissue with practiced efficiency. Speed is everything. The fastest surgeons could amputate a leg in less than 3 minutes. This is considered impressive and merciful. The bone must be sawed through. This takes longer because bones don't cooperate and the saw frequently jams. The sound is worse than you're imagining. The sensation, well, the human brain wasn't designed to process these particular signals, and it protests by trying to shut down consciousness, which is honestly the body's most useful contribution to the procedure. Mainstream fact: Robert Liston, a famous British surgeon in the 1840s, was known as the fastest knife in the West End. He could amputate a leg in 28 seconds. In one famous surgery, he moved so fast that he also amputated his assistant's fingers and slashed a spectator's coat. The spectator died of shock, thinking he'd been stabbed. The assistant died of infection. The patient also died of infection. It's possibly the only surgical procedure in history with a 300% mortality rate. Arteries must be tied off to prevent bleeding out. This requires identifying each major blood vessel in a rapidly expanding pool of blood, clamping it, tying it with silk thread, and hoping it holds. In the 1840s, there's no understanding of infection yet, so that silk thread, it probably was used before. The surgeon's hands definitely was before, unwashed. The shared sponge being used to soak up blood, you don't want to know its history.
Finally, the stump is fashioned. Skin flaps are pulled over the exposed tissue and bone, and the whole mass is stitched together with the same casual attitude toward contamination that's pervaded the entire procedure. Bandages are applied, bandages that were probably washed after the last use but certainly weren't sterilized, because sterilization isn't a concept yet. You've survived the surgery. Congratulations. Now you get to face the real challenge: surviving the aftermath. Because in the pre-anesthesia, pre-antiseptic era, the surgery is frequently the least dangerous part of the whole experience. Joke 1. Victorian surgeons had a saying: "The operation was a success, but the patient died." This was not considered ironic, it was literally their success metric. Did you complete the technical procedure? Success. Did the patient survive? Well, that part was between them and God. But we're being unfair to Victorian surgeons, or at least to the good ones. Within the constraints of their knowledge and tools, they performed remarkable feats. They removed bladder stones, repaired hernias, treated club feet, cut out tumors, and developed innovative techniques that would lay the groundwork for modern surgery. They did this while their patients screamed, while blood sprayed, while assistants fainted, and while the risk of any patient surviving more than a few weeks post-surgery was basically a coin toss. The psychological toll on surgeons was significant.
Many turned to alcohol to cope with the trauma of causing such suffering, even when they knew it was necessary. Some left the profession entirely. Others developed a sort of emotional detachment that made them seem callous, but was probably the only way they could function. Operating on conscious patients who begged, screamed, and sometimes died on the table would damage anyone's mental health. Then came October 16, 1846, in Boston, Massachusetts. Dentist William Morton publicly demonstrated the use of ether as an anesthetic during a surgical procedure. The news spread across the Atlantic faster than most diseases. British surgeons read about it in medical journals, were skeptical, tried it anyway, and found it actually worked. Surgical anesthesia was born. Well, reborn. People had been trying to eliminate surgical pain for centuries. Alcohol, opium, various herbal concoctions, even concussion, hitting patients in the head to knock them out, which often worked in that they stopped moving, though for various reasons. But ether and then chloroform provided reliable, controllable unconsciousness that made complex surgery feasible. Mainstream fact: the first use of ether anesthesia in Britain was at University College Hospital in London on December 21, 1846, just 2 months after the Boston demonstration. Dr. Robert Liston, yes, the speedy surgeon, amputated a leg while the patient was under ether anesthesia. Afterward, when the patient woke up and realized the surgery was over, he asked, "When are you going to begin?" Liston turned to the observers and said, "This Yankee Dodge, gentlemen, beats mesmerism hollow." Chloroform came next, in 1847, discovered by several people independently, but popularized by Scottish obstetrician James Simpson. Chloroform had advantages over ether. It worked faster, didn't irritate the lungs as much, and didn't require the patient to breathe from a large glass globe for several minutes. It also had disadvantages, primarily that it could kill you quite easily if the dosage wasn't precisely controlled, which it frequently wasn't because Victorian measurement systems were more art than science. Queen Victoria's use of chloroform during the birth of Prince Leopold in 1853 gave it a massive publicity boost. If it was good enough for the Queen, it was good enough for anyone. The fact that the Queen could afford the best anesthesiast in the country and precise dosing equipment that most hospitals couldn't dream of was conveniently overlooked. Now let's return to you on your surgery day, except now we're in 1850-something and anesthesia exists. You're still terrified, but for different reasons. You're wheeled, or carried, depending on the hospital's budget, to the operating theater. This is a real theater, an amphitheater-style room with galleries where medical students and curious doctors gather to watch. Surgery has become spectator sport, though arguably less gory than it used to be, since the patients aren't screaming anymore. The operating theater at Guy's Hospital in London, one still exists, preserved as a museum, gives you the perfect picture. A wooden operating table in the center, a gallery of steeply raked wooden benches around it, a skylight above for natural light, because gas lights can spark and cause explosions when ether fumes are present, and sawdust on the floor to catch the blood. The table has no padding because padding is hard to clean. You lie directly on wood, which is at least democratic. Everyone gets the same uncomfortable experience. Quirky tidbit: the sawdust under operating tables came from the floors of butcher shops. Hospitals bought it in bulk. This is either efficient recycling or deeply unsettling symbolism depending on your perspective. The anesthetist arrives. This might be a doctor especially trained in anesthesia, or it might be a medical student earning extra money, or it might be whoever happened to be standing nearby when they needed someone. Training and certification for anesthetists is still decades away. He carries a bottle of chloroform and a piece of cloth or a specialized inhaler apparatus. You're instructed to lie still. The cloth or mask is placed over your face. Chloroform is dripped onto it, drop by drop, and you're told to breathe normally. The smell is sweet and slightly sickly. Your head begins to swim. The voices around you become distant. The world develops soft edges. And then, nothing. From your perspective, surgery is now a blessing. You go to sleep in the theater and wake up in the ward with a bandaged stump where your leg used to be, feeling like you've been hit by a train, but grateful you don't remember any of it. From the surgeon's perspective, anesthesia is revolutionary but complicated. On one hand, he can now take his time. No need to amputate a leg in 28 seconds when the patient isn't screaming and thrashing. He can be precise, careful, methodical. He can attempt complex procedures that would have been impossible when speed was paramount. He can remove tumors from delicate areas, repair internal injuries, perform plastic surgery to correct deformities. He did this while their patients screamed, while blood sprayed, while assistants fainted, and while the risk of any patient surviving more than a few weeks post-surgery was basically a coin toss. The psychological toll on surgeons was significant. Many turned to alcohol to cope with the trauma of causing such suffering, even when they knew it was necessary. Some left the profession entirely. Others developed a sort of emotional detachment that made them seem callous, but was probably the only way they could function. Operating on conscious patients who begged, screamed, and sometimes died on the table would damage anyone's mental health. Then came October 16, 1846, in Boston, Massachusetts. Dentist William Morton publicly demonstrated the use of ether as an anesthetic during a surgical procedure. The news spread across the Atlantic faster than most diseases. British surgeons read about it in medical journals, were skeptical, tried it anyway.
Finally, the stump is fashioned. Skin flaps were pulled over the exposed tissue and bone, and the whole mess is stitched together with the same casual attitude toward contamination that's pervaded the entire procedure. Bandages are applied, bandages that were probably washed after the last use but certainly weren't sterilized, because sterilization isn't a concept yet. You've survived the surgery. Congratulations! Now you get to face the real challenge, surviving the aftermath. Because in the pre-anesthesia, pre-antiseptic era, the surgery is frequently the least dangerous part of the whole experience. Joke 1. Victorian surgeons had a saying, "The operation was a success, but the patient died." This was not considered ironic, it was literally their success metric. Did you complete the technical procedure? Success. Did the patient survive? Well, that part was between them and God. But we're being unfair to Victorian surgeons, or at least to the good ones. Within the constraints of their knowledge and tools, they performed remarkable feats. They removed bladder stones, repaired hernias, treated club feet, cut out tumors, and developed innovative techniques that would lay the groundwork for modern surgery. They did this while their patients screamed, while blood sprayed, while assistants fainted, and while the risk of any patient surviving more than a few weeks post-surgery was basically a coin toss. The psychological toll on surgeons was significant. Many turned to alcohol to cope with the trauma of causing such suffering, even when they knew it was necessary. Some left the profession entirely. Others developed a sort of emotional detachment that made them seem callous, but was probably the only way they could function. Operating on conscious patients who begged, screamed, and sometimes died on the table would damage anyone's mental health. Then came October 16, 1846, in Boston, Massachusetts. Dentist William Morton publicly demonstrated the use of ether as an anesthetic during a surgical procedure. The news spread across the Atlantic faster than most diseases. British surgeons read about it in medical journals, were skeptical, tried it anyway, and found it actually worked. Surgical anesthesia was born. Well, reborn. People had been trying to eliminate surgical pain for centuries. Alcohol, opium, various herbal concoctions, even concussion, hitting patients in the head to knock them out, which often worked in that they stopped moving, though for various reasons. But ether and then chloroform provided reliable, controllable unconsciousness that made complex surgery feasible. Mainstream fact. The first use of ether anesthesia in Britain was at University College Hospital in London on December 21, 1846, just 2 months after the Boston demonstration. Dr. Robert List,
The surgeon can now also perform longer, more complex operations. But here's the terrible irony. For a while, this made things worse. Anesthesia solved the pain problem, but not the infection problem. Surgeons started attempting operations they'd never tried before. Deep abdominal surgeries, brain surgeries, complex orthopedic procedures. These longer surgeries gave infections more opportunities to establish themselves.
Mortality rates initially increased after the introduction of anesthesia because surgeons were attempting riskier procedures without understanding why patients died afterward. Picture the scene. The surgeon, in his street clothes covered by that blood-stiffed coat we mentioned, makes his incision. He's taking his time now, explaining his technique to the students in the gallery. His instruments aren't sterile. They've been wiped clean, perhaps rinsed, maybe even dipped in carbolic acid if this is after Lister's work has penetrated his consciousness. But sterile? No. His hands aren't washed beyond a quick rinse. He might have done a post-mortem examination this morning and surgery now with only a casual hand wipe in between. He digs into the operative site with confidence. If something drops on the floor, an instrument, a sponge, it's picked up, brushed off, and put back into use. The concept of a sterile field doesn't exist yet. The same sponges are used on multiple patients. Blood from the current surgery mingles with blood from the last one in the fibers of those sponges. Bacteria throw parties in those sponges. Patients die from infections originating in those sponges. But look, he's successfully removing the source of infection from your leg. The gangrenous tissue is cut away, the damaged bone removed, the wound shaped and stitched with silk thread that's been used before and will be used again. He's pleased with his work. The students applaud. You're wheeled back to your ward, none the wiser about the microscopic invaders that are already setting up camp in your surgical wound. Joke 2. Victorian surgeons washing their hands between surgeries was like modern people washing their hands between touching doorknobs. It happened, but not consistently, and nobody really understood why it mattered until someone drew them very insistent pictures with charts. Then Joseph Lister appears, bless him. In the 1860s, Lister, a British surgeon working in Glasgow, reads Louis Pasteur's work on fermentation and begins wondering if microscopic organisms might cause wound infections the same way they cause milk to spoil. This seems obvious now. In 1865, it was radical. Lister starts experimenting with carbolic acid, phenol, as an antiseptic. He soaks instruments in it. He sprays it in the air during surgeries using a device that looks like a plant mister on steroids. He irrigates wounds with it. His patients stop dying at the alarming rate that everyone else's patients are dying. Other surgeons notice. Some adopt his methods immediately. Others think he's a quack selling snake oil, except the snake oil is carbolic acid and it demonstrably works. Mainstream fact. Lister's antiseptic technique reduced mortality from amputations at Glasgow Royal Infirmary from 45% to 15% within a few years. This is a staggering improvement. Yet many surgeons resisted adopting his methods for years, partly from professional pride, partly from genuine skepticism, and partly because the carbolic spray was unpleasant to work with. It irritated surgeons' hands, made operating theaters smell like a chemical factory, and added complexity to procedures. By the 1870s and 1880s, the combination of anesthesia and antiseptic technique has revolutionized surgery. Operations that would have been death sentences are now survivable. Surgeons can open the abdomen and successfully repair internal injuries. They can remove appendices, repair hernias, remove ovarian tumors, perform cesarean sections with the mother surviving. The field of surgery explodes with possibility. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's stay in our transitional period where anesthesia exists, but antisepsis is still being debated in medical journals with the intensity usually reserved for religious schisms. Your surgery is complete. You're wheeled back to the ward, which you left vertical and return horizontal. The anesthesia wears off over the next few hours. You drift in and out of consciousness, vaguely aware of the ward around you, mostly aware of pain. Because here's the thing about anesthesia. It solves pain during surgery, but afterward, that's what morphine and laudanum are for, and hospitals are cautious about dispensing them because addiction is a real concern and morphine costs money. Your stump throbs. This is normal. The nurses check on you regularly, taking your pulse, noting your color, watching for signs of bleeding or shock. If you're lucky, the surgery will heal cleanly. The stitches will hold, new tissue will form. In a few weeks, you'll be fitted for a wooden leg and sent back out into the world with instructions to return if anything goes wrong. If you're unlucky, and many people are unlucky, infection sets in within a few days. Your stump becomes hot, red, swollen. Pus develops. The famous laudable pus that doctors used to celebrate is now recognized as a sign of bacterial infection. though bacteria itself is a new concept that some older doctors reject. Fever comes, rigors, shaking chills that make the bed rattle, delirium. Quirky tidbit. Some hospitals had fever nurses who specialized in caring for post-surgical infection cases. This was like having a house fire coordinator, necessary because the problem occurred so frequently, but tragic that such a position needed to exist. The surgeon returns to check on you. If the infection is localized, he might reopen the wound to drain it. If it's spreading, if you're developing septicemia or pyemium, there's little he can do except keep you comfortable and hope. Amputation to stop spreading infection only works if you amputate before the infection reaches the bloodstream. Once it's systemic, you're on God's hands, and God's track record with septicemia is not encouraging.
In the worst cases, you develop what's called hospital gangrene, a rapidly spreading bacterial infection that causes tissue to die and rot while the patient is still alive. It smells like death because it is death, just taking its time. Hospital gangrene can spread from patient to patient through contact, through contaminated instruments, through the hands of nurses and doctors. It's so common that hospitals have gangrene wards where affected patients are isolated to prevent the entire hospital from becoming infected. Joke 3. Having a gangrene ward is like having a fire containment room in a wooden building. It acknowledges the problem while doing nothing to solve it, which is very Victorian. But let's say you're fortunate. Your surgery heals cleanly. The infection never comes, or comes mildly and is fought off by our immune system. The stitches are removed after a week or two, or they're left in to work their way out naturally, depending on the surgeon's preference. The wound closes, scar tissue forms. You've survived Victorian surgery, which puts you in the minority, but not such a small minority that it's unheard of. You spend a few more weeks in the hospital regaining strength, learning to balance without your leg, receiving visits from the charitable ladies who provide funds for your wooden leg. The prosthetist visits the ward with measuring tools and sketches. Wooden legs are custom fitted, heavy, uncomfortable, and subject to splinters, but they're better than nothing. Some are quite ingenious with articulated joints and leather straps. Others are basically fancy pegs. You get what you can afford or what charity provides. The day comes for your discharge. The ward sister gives you instructions. Keep the stump clean, watch for signs of infection, redness, heat, pus, fever. Return immediately if anything seems wrong. You're given a paper with details of your surgery in case you need to see another doctor. You leave the hospital on crutches or with your new wooden leg, wobbling slightly, grateful to be alive, traumatized by the experience, and aware that you've just survived something that kills thousands of people every year. Surgical innovation continues throughout the Victorian era. Surgeons develop new techniques, share knowledge through medical journals and conferences, and gradually transform surgery from a last resort butchery to a scientific discipline. The discovery of X-rays in 1895 gives surgeons the ability to see inside patients without cutting them open first, which is helpful for planning procedures and not accidentally cutting into unexpected organs. Specialization emerges. General surgeons who did everything from amputations to tumor removals give way to specialists, orthopedic surgeons for bones and joints, ophthalmic surgeons for eyes, neurosurgeons for the brain and nervous system. Surgery becomes a career path requiring years of training rather than something any physician could do if they had a steady hand and strong stomach. Mainstream fact. The first successful removal of a brain tumor was performed by Scottish surgeon Sir William McEwen in 1879. The patient was a 14-year-old girl, and she survived the surgery and recovered fully. This was barely 2 decades after surgeons were still debating whether opening the skull was even survivable. The speed of surgical advancement in the late Victorian era is genuinely remarkable. Operating theaters become operating rooms. The amphitheater setup with student galleries gives way to smaller, more controlled environments where only necessary personnel are present. Surgical gowns and gloves are introduced. Rubber gloves first appear in the 1890s, initially to protect surgeons' hands from carbolic acid rather than to protect patients from surgeons' hands, but the result is the same. Antiseptic technique evolves into aseptic technique, the difference being that antiseptic means killing bacteria on surfaces and in wounds, while aseptic means preventing bacterial contamination in the first place. It's the difference between mopping up a spill and not spilling in the first place. By the 1890s, forward-thinking hospitals are sterilizing instruments with steam, wearing clean surgical gowns, and accepting that yes, doctors should wash their hands, and no, this isn't an insult to their professionalism. But throughout this evolution, patients continue to experience surgery as a terrifying ordeal. Yes, you're unconscious for it now. Yes, you're more likely to survive. But you're still being cut open by someone with a knife. Your body is still being fundamentally altered. The recovery is still painful, slow, and uncertain. The risk of infection remains significant, even with antiseptic precautions. And the psychological impact of knowing you need surgery, of anticipating it, experiencing it, and recovering from it is profound. Hospitals develop preoperative routines to try to improve outcomes. Patients are bathed, shaved if necessary, given enemas to empty the bowels. Operating on someone with full intestines can be messy if things go wrong, and are kept fasting for several hours before surgery. The night before surgery is sleepless for most patients, despite nurses' best efforts to be reassuring. Quirky tidbit: some surgeons developed pre-operative superstitions that would make modern ethicists weep. One famous surgeon insisted on operating only on Tuesdays, claiming his success rate was higher. Another wore the same lucky waistcoat for every major surgery until it literally fell apart. These superstitions probably helped the surgeons more than the patients, providing a sense of control in an environment where so much was still uncertain. Post-operative care improves alongside surgical technique. Nurses learn to monitor patients more carefully, watching for early signs of complications. Pain management becomes more systematic, with regular morphine doses scheduled rather than dispensed only when patients beg. Nutritional support improves. Surgical patients receive beef tea, milk, eggs, and other foods thought to promote healing, even if the regular ward food remains aggressively bland. By the end of the Victorian era, surgery has been transformed from a desperate last resort to a legitimate medical treatment with reasonable survival rates. A patient in 1900 facing the same surgery you underwent in 1850 has a much better chance of survival, will experience less pain, and will heal faster with fewer complications. This is genuine progress, the kind that saves lives and reduces suffering. But it's worth remembering what that progress cost. Every successful technique was developed through trial and error, and the errors killed people. Every innovation had to overcome resistance from practitioners who were comfortable with the old ways. Every improvement in survival rates still meant that people died, just fewer of them.
As you lie in your bed, one-legged but alive, you become a living testimony to Victorian surgical advancement. You survived anesthesia without your heart stopping. You survived the surgery without bleeding to death. You survived the post-operative period without succumbing to infection. You are, statistically speaking, lucky. You're also traumatized, in pain, and facing a future with significant disability. But you're alive. The surgeon who operated on you will note your case in his records. If you survive to discharge, you're a success. If you die, you're a learning opportunity. Either way, you've contributed to the gradual accumulation of knowledge that future patients will benefit from. This is cold comfort when you're the one lying in the bed, but it's something. Tomorrow, we'll talk about the nurses who keep you alive after the surgeon has finished his dramatic work and returned his consulting rooms to see private patients. Because surgery might be the theatrical centerpiece of Victorian hospital life, but nursing is the stage crew that makes the show possible at all. For now, rest. Your stump aches despite the morphine. The ward is settling into its evening routine. The patient in the next bed is praying again. He's been praying since his surgery 3 days ago, a constant murmur of Hail Marys and Our Fathers. It's annoying, but also oddly soothing, a reminder that you're not alone in your suffering. The nurse brings your evening medicine, checks your bandages, and adjusts your pillow with surprising gentleness. She's seen thousands of patients come through these wards.
She knows who will survive and who won't, though she'd never tell you which categories you thinks you're in. She just does her job, day after day, surgery after surgery, infection after infection, until it's time for the next shift. Sleep, if you can. Tomorrow brings doctor's rounds, and you'll learn whether your stump is healing properly or whether complications are developing. But for tonight, you survived surgery, and that's enough of an achievement to rest on. Morning arrives with its usual indifference to human suffering, and with it comes the nurse who will define your hospital experience far more than any surgeon ever could. She's at your bedside before you're fully awake, checking your pulse, examining your bandages, asking questions about your pain level, and making notes on the chart at the end of your bed. Her name, let's say, is Sarah, though in the Victorian hospital hierarchy you'll call her nurse or nothing at all. Sarah is 28 years old, has been working in hospitals for a decade, and has seen more death, suffering, and bodily fluids than most people encounter in several lifetimes. Before Florence Nightingale's reforms began filtering through British hospitals in the late 1850s and beyond, Sarah might have been barely literate, possibly alcoholic, and generally regarded by society as one step above a prostitute in respectability. After the reforms, she might be educated, trained, and regarded as a professional woman performing a noble calling. The timing of your hospital stay determines which version of Sarah you get. Let's start with the before picture, because understanding where nursing came from makes you appreciate where it went. In the early Victorian period, hospital nursing is not a profession. It's barely a job. It's more like a last resort for women who have exhausted all other options. The typical nurse in 1840 is a working-class woman, often widowed or unmarried, frequently a former patient herself who stayed on because she had nowhere else to go. She receives minimal wages, sometimes less than the hospital cleaners, plus room, board, and a beer allowance. Yes, beer allowance. Nurses are provided with beer as part of their compensation, typically a couple of pints per day, more if they can wheedle it from the hospital steward. Mainstream fact: hospital beer rations were standard across Victorian institutions, not just in hospitals but in workhouses, asylums, and even prisons. The beer was small beer, low alcohol content, and was considered safer to drink than water, which wasn't always wrong given the state of Victorian water supplies. But it also meant that chronic drunkenness among hospital staff was a genuine problem. These early Victorian nurses received no formal training. They learn by doing, which means they learn by making mistakes on patients who can't complain effectively because they're sick, dying, or dead. A new nurse might arrive in the ward on Monday morning, be told this is a bandage, these are bedpans, don't let anyone die on your shift, and left to figure out the rest through observation and trial and error. Lots of error. Their duties are primarily custodial rather than medical. They clean, they feed patients, they empty bedpans, they strip beds, they wash bodies, both living and dead. They might assist during doctors' rounds, holding instruments or patients as directed, but they're not expected to have opinions about treatment. They're not expected to notice patterns or declining conditions. They're expected to follow orders and not trouble the doctors with unnecessary questions. Quirky tidbit: many early Victorian nurses supplemented their meager income by acting as unofficial undertakers. When a patient died, the nurse would lay out the body, and the patient's family would sometimes pay her directly for this service. This created a perverse incentive where nurses might be more financially motivated by death than recovery. Nobody thought this system through very carefully. Charles Dickens captured the popular perception of pre-reform nurses in his character Cyrie Gamp from Martin Chuzzlewit, 1843 to 1844. Cyrie is drunk, incompetent, callous, and mercenary. She's more interested in her gin than her patients. She's slovenly, dishonest, and emblematic of everything wrong with working-class women given positions of authority over their betters. Dickens was satirizing, but his satire hit close enough to reality that the name Gamp became shorthand for bad nurse throughout the Victorian era.
But here's what Dickens and most middle-class observers missed. These women were working 12-hour shifts or longer in appalling conditions for poverty wages. They were expected to be cheerful, subservient, and energetic while doing back-breaking physical labor that would exhaust anyone. They were given no training, no support, and no respect, then blamed when patient outcomes were poor. Some were drunk and incompetent, yes. Many were doing their best under impossible circumstances, with no resources and no hope of improvement. Expecting Victorian nurses to remain sober and cheerful while working 12-hour shifts for less money than a factory worker with no training and constant exposure to death is like expecting a puddle to remain dry in the rain. Technically, you can demand it, but don't be surprised when it doesn't comply. Then came the Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, and with it, Florence Nightingale, who would become simultaneously the savior of nursing and an absolute tyrant, depending on who you asked and when. Nightingale came from a wealthy, educated family, the kind of family where daughters were expected to make good marriages and manage households, not traipse off to war zones and fuss over common soldiers. But Florence had other ideas. She felt called to nursing, literally called by God, she believed, and spent years studying hospital administration and nursing practices in Europe, including at the Kaiserswerth Deaconess Institution in Germany, where Protestant deaconesses received actual training in patient care. When the British Army found itself in the Crimea with thousands of wounded soldiers and minimal medical support, Nightingale volunteered to take a team of nurses to the military hospital at Scutari, now part of Istanbul. The Secretary of War, desperate and out of options, said yes. Nightingale arrived with 38 nurses to find conditions that made British hospitals look like luxury spas. Mainstream fact: the Scutari hospital was a nightmare of neglect. Patients lay in their own excrement. The sewers beneath the hospital were blocked and leaking. Supplies were chaotically disorganized or missing entirely. More soldiers were dying of disease and infection in the hospital than were dying in battle. The mortality rate when Nightingale arrived was around 42%. Through improved sanitation, organization, and care, she and her team reduced it to 2% within 6 months. Nightingale returned to Britain a celebrity, though she spent much of her later life as an invalid, possibly due to an illness contracted in the Crimea, possibly psychosomatic, historians still argue. But her celebrity gave her a platform, and she used it ruthlessly. She wrote Notes on Nursing, 1859, which became the foundational text for modern nursing. She established the Nightingale Training School for Nurses at St. Thomas's Hospital in London in 1860, funded by donations from a grateful public. She campaigned for hospital reform, for better sanitation, for trained nurses, for systematic care. The Nightingale model of nursing had several key components. First, nursing should be a respectable profession for educated women. Nightingale actively recruited middle-class women, believing they would bring discipline, refinement, and moral authority to the wards. This was classist, but it worked. Nursing's reputation improved dramatically once ladies started doing it.
And some patients died in asylums from their underlying conditions, from physical illnesses exacerbated by institutional life, from suicide, or from accidents. Death rates in asylums were tracked carefully, with medical superintendents defensive about any suggestion their care might be deadly. Inquests investigated suspicious deaths, though investigations often rubber-stamped institutional explanations. Specific conditions were treated differently. General paralysis of the insane, GPI, actually late-stage neurosyphilis, was recognized as progressive and fatal. Patients deteriorated through mania, dementia, paralysis, and death over months or years. Treatment was essentially palliative, keeping patients comfortable as they declined. Your time in the Victorian medical system is coming to an end. Whether you've survived the hospital ward, recovered from surgery, endured treatments, or spent time in the asylum, you've experienced Victorian medicine at its most institutional. You've learned that Victorian hospitals were simultaneously places of healing and harm.
where dedicated nurses provided compassionate care while doctors applied treatments ranging from helpful to horrifying. You've seen how class determined care quality, how medical theory was years ahead of medical practice, and how suffering was considered both unfortunate and somewhat inevitable. The Victorian medical world was transitioning from humoral theory to germ theory, from surgery without anesthesia to surgery without as much dying afterward, from nursing as last resort employment to nursing as respected profession, from asylums as prisons to asylums as sometimes therapeutic institutions. Progress was real but uneven. A patient in 1900 had dramatically better survival chances than in 1850, but still faced risks that would horrify modern people. The Victorian medical establishment was learning, slowly and at tremendous human cost, lessons that would transform into modern medicine. Joke 3. Victorian medicine's greatest achievement was surviving long enough to be replaced by something better. Every treatment failure, every patient lost, every horrific procedure added incrementally to knowledge that eventually produced actual cures. It's just unfortunate that being an incremental data point was so unpleasant for the patients involved. As you leave the hospital or asylum, walking out into Victorian London's foggy streets, you carry with you the experience of surviving Victorian medicine. You've been bled, purged, possibly amputated, definitely underfed, and treated with substances ranging from marginally helpful to actively poisonous. But you survived. And that survival, multiplied by millions of patients across decades, represents the raw data from which modern medicine emerged. The Victorian medical system was brutal, experimental, frequently wrong, and sometimes accidentally right. It treated patients as both precious individuals deserving care and as experimental subjects in an ongoing trial and error process. It combined genuine compassion with casual cruelty, cutting-edge innovation with stubborn tradition, and remarkable progress with tragic waste. And every patient who survived to tell their story contributed to the slow, painful evolution from Victorian medicine to something approaching modern care. So the next time you complain about waiting rooms or hospital food, take a moment to appreciate that you're not lying in a ward with 40 other people, breathing carbolic-scented air, watching the patient next to you cough blood, while a doctor explains that your laudable pus means treatment is progressing nicely, just before prescribing mercury for your fever. Victorian medicine was simultaneously the foundation of modern healthcare and a testament to how much progress was needed. The nurses, doctors, and patients of the Victorian era endured conditions we can barely imagine to build the knowledge base we take for granted. If you've made it this far, thank you for joining me on this journey through Victorian hospital horrors. Drop a comment about which aspect you found most disturbing. I'm guessing all of it will be popular answer. Sleep well, knowing that modern medicine, for all its flaws, is infinitely better than what our Victorian ancestors endured. Until next time, pleasant dreams. Or at least dreams without laudanum, leeches, or amputations performed with confidence but questionable sterility.
Some hospitals experimented with nurse uniform variations to indicate specialization. Surgical nurses might have red cuffs, fever nurses yellow, maternity nurses blue. This helped patients identify which nurse to call for what problem, and also helped hospitals track which nurses were doing which work. It's unclear whether anyone enjoyed being the yellow-cuffed fever nurse, but at least it was clear communication. Evening brings supper service, final medication rounds, and preparation for night. Emma checks that every patient is comfortable, or as comfortable as possible given their condition. She ensures night nurses have adequate notes about each patient. She reports concerns to the ward sister. And finally, at 8 p.m., she's off duty. She retreats to the nurse's home, a residence attached to or near the hospital where nurses live under strict supervision. The nurse's home has rules: no male visitors, no alcohol, curfew at 10 p.m., lights out at 10:30 p.m. Nurses are expected to be moral exemplars at all times. Their behavior reflects on the profession. Emma is too tired to care about moral exemplification. She eats a quick meal, writes a letter to her mother, she's too tired for that too, but does it anyway, and collapses into bed. 12 hours later, she'll do it all again. The professionalization of nursing created genuine benefits for patients. Trained nurses caught complications earlier, provided better basic care, reduced infection rates through improved hygiene, and generally made hospital stays less horrific. But it also created a rigidly hierarchical, often punitive system where nurses were worked to exhaustion, paid poorly, better than before but still poorly, and expected to sacrifice normal human needs and desires for their profession. Nursing training schools proliferated. By the 1880s and 1890s, most British hospitals had training programs. Standards varied. Some were rigorous, others were barely more than apprenticeships. But the principle was established. Nurses needed training, and that training should combine practical experience with theoretical knowledge. The curriculum covered an increasing range of topics as medical knowledge expanded: bacteriology and antiseptic technique after Lister's work, temperature taking and other vital sign monitoring, medication administration and dosage calculation, wound care and bandaging techniques, diet and nutrition, patient positioning and moving, and the psychological aspects of care. Nurses also learned the unspoken curriculum: how to manage difficult patients, how to work with doctors who resented educated nurses, how to get adequate supplies from a miserly hospital administration, how to recognize which rules could be bent and which were inviolable, and how to cope with the emotional toll of constant exposure to suffering and death. Joke 3. A fully trained Victorian nurse could identify 17 types of cough by sound alone, predict patient outcomes with uncanny accuracy, and manage a ward of 40 patients on 3 hours of sleep. But she couldn't vote, own property if married, or expect to be paid even half what a male hospital porter earned. Progress is sometimes weirdly selective. Nursing specializations emerged. Some nurses focused on surgery, learning to assist in operating theaters and manage post-operative care. Others specialized in fever nursing, dealing with infectious diseases in isolation wards. Midwifery nursing became a respected specialty, though it remained separate from general nursing training. District nursing, caring for patients in their homes, grew as reformers realized that many people needed nursing care but couldn't or wouldn't enter hospitals. The profession also began to organize. The British Nurses Association was founded in 1887, campaigning for nurse registration and uniform standards. This was controversial. Some thought government regulation was unnecessary interference. Others saw it as essential protection for both nurses and patients. The battle over nurse registration would continue into the 20th century. But throughout this professionalization, certain tensions remained unresolved. Nursing was women's work, which meant it was automatically valued less than men's work, regardless of skill level. It required education and intelligence, but nurses were expected to be subservient to doctors, all male. It demanded emotional strength and resilience, but nurses who became hardened were criticized for losing their feminine compassion. The profession asked for modern, educated women,
then tried to mold them into Victorian ideals of feminine self-sacrifice. Class tensions persisted too. Middle-class nurses, the Nightingale ideal, brought education and refinement, but sometimes lacked the physical stamina for the work and could be condescending to working-class patients. Working-class nurses had stamina and practical skills, but might lack formal education and the refined manners that hospitals increasingly demanded. The profession tried to have it both ways, working-class strength with middle-class refinement. This created friction. Mainstream fact. By 1900, there were approximately 64,000 nurses in England and Wales, compared to perhaps 1,000 in 1850. The profession had exploded in size, prestige, and organization. Nursing had become a respectable career for women, one of the few professional options available to those who needed or wanted to work. This transformation happened within a single generation, which is genuinely remarkable. Let's return to Emma, our Nightingale nurse. After 5 years on the wards, she's being considered for promotion to ward sister. This would mean a small pay increase, her own room in the nurses' home, authority over the staff nurses and probationers, and the heavy responsibility of ward management. She'll take it because it's the next step, because she's good at her job, because the alternative is leaving nursing or staying a staff nurse forever. As ward sister, Emma will have even longer hours, more responsibility, and the constant stress of balancing patient care, doctor demands, hospital administration, and nursing staff management. She'll be respected by patients, feared by probationers, and occasionally undermined by doctors who don't like taking orders from women. She'll save lives through vigilant observation and quick action. She'll watch people die despite her best efforts. She'll train the next generation of nurses, passing on both official curriculum and hard-won practical knowledge.
She'll remain unmarried because hospital rules prohibit married nurses. Marriage means automatic dismissal. This rule ensures that nurses remain focused on their work without the distraction of husbands and children, and also ensures a steady supply of young nurses to replace those who marry and leave. Some nurses view this as a fair trade, independence and meaningful work in exchange for traditional family life. Others resent the forced choice. Emma hasn't decided which category she's in yet. Quirky tidbit. Some hospitals experimented with allowing married nurses to continue working, but the arrangements were awkward. If both husband and wife worked at the hospital, they might see each other less than if they lived separately. Children were absolutely not allowed in the nurse's home, so married nurses with children had to find outside accommodation, which on a nurse's salary was nearly impossible. The system essentially enforced celibacy through economic pressure rather than explicit rule. The daily rhythm of ward life under trained nursing is dramatically different from the pre-reform chaos. Emma's ward runs like clockwork, medications given precisely on schedule, wounds dressed with antiseptic technique, patients positioned correctly to prevent bed sores, nutrition monitored and documented, symptoms reported immediately rather than waiting for doctor's rounds. The ward is cleaner, quieter, more organized. Patients still suffer and die, but they do so with more dignity and better care. Emma has learned to manage difficult situations that nursing training only partially prepared her for. The patient who refuses all treatment because he's given up hope, Emma cajoles, encourages, and sometimes just sits with him until he's ready to try again. The family who wants aggressive treatment for their dying relative when peaceful comfort care would be kinder. Emma helps doctors communicate prognosis gently but clearly. The doctor who's wrong about a diagnosis but won't listen to nursing observations, Emma documents everything carefully and finds ways to advocate for her patient without directly challenging medical authority. She's also learned the emotional management that makes long-term nursing survivable. She cares about her patients deeply, but can't become emotionally devastated by every death, or she'd never survive. She's developed the professional distance that looks like coldness to outsiders, but is actually self-preservation.
She allows herself to grieve for some patients, the ones who touched her heart particularly, but she does it privately, in her room, late at night when the day's work is finally done. Joke 4. Victorian nurses were expected to have the emotional resilience of Stoics, the physical endurance of marathon runners, the medical knowledge of doctors, the housekeeping skills of perfect servants, the moral purity of saints, and the salary expectations of optimistic children. Shockingly, recruitment was sometimes difficult. The impact of nursing reform extended beyond hospitals. District nursing, pioneered by reformers like William Rathbone in Liverpool, brought trained nurses into patients' homes, particularly in poor neighborhoods. District nurses visited families, provided medical care, taught basic hygiene, and served as a bridge between the formal medical system and communities that distrusted or couldn't access hospital care. These nurses faced unique challenges. They worked independently, without the support structure of a hospital ward. They entered homes where conditions were appalling: overcrowding, lack of sanitation, poverty that made basic care almost impossible. They treated patients in beds shared with siblings, in rooms with no heat, with families who couldn't afford the medicines prescribed. They improvised constantly, making do with what was available, teaching families to continue care between visits. District nurses also faced social challenges. They entered communities as outsiders, middle-class women in working-class neighborhoods. Some were welcomed as angels of mercy. Others were resented as interfering busybodies who judged poor families without understanding their circumstances. The best district nurses learned to listen as much as they instructed, to respect family practices while introducing evidence-based care, to advocate for their patients without condescension. Mainstream fact: by the 1890s, district nursing associations existed in most major British cities. These nurses made hundreds of thousands of home visits annually, treating illnesses, attending births, caring for chronic conditions, and providing end-of-life care to people who died at home, which was most people. Their impact on public health, particularly infant mortality rates, was significant, though hard to quantify precisely. Nursing specialties continued to develop. Fever nursing became increasingly important as hospitals established isolation wards for infectious diseases. Fever nurses needed additional training in managing highly contagious patients, using isolation techniques, and protecting themselves from infection. They wore different uniforms, often with washable oilcloth aprons, followed strict protocols for entering and leaving isolation wards, and accepted higher risk in exchange for, well, actually not much additional pay, but the satisfaction of knowing they were preventing epidemics, mostly the satisfaction. Mental health nursing, or asylum nursing, emerged as asylums expanded and reformers pushed for more therapeutic approaches to mental illness. Asylum nurses dealt with patients who might be violent, unpredictable, or simply deeply confused and frightened. They needed physical strength to manage aggressive patients, psychological insight to understand behaviors, and endless patience for patients whose conditions might never improve. We'll talk more about asylums later, but asylum nurses deserve recognition for working in some of the most challenging healthcare environments with some of the most stigmatized patients. Midwifery nursing became more formalized, though it retained its separate identity from general nursing. Midwives attended births, provided prenatal and postnatal care, and managed normal deliveries without physician assistance. The relationship between midwives and doctors was often fraught. Doctors increasingly wanted to control childbirth as a medical event, while midwives argued that normal childbirth didn't require medical intervention. This tension would continue well into the 20th century. Quirky tidbit: some hospitals experimented with massage nurses who provided therapeutic massage to patients recovering from paralysis, injuries, or surgery. This was based on legitimate therapeutic principles, though the line between medical massage and inappropriate touching was constantly policed. Massage nurses needed certification and worked only under physician orders, but their existence shows how Victorian medicine was slowly expanding the scope of nursing practice.
Training became more rigorous and standardized. By the 1890s, a typical nursing training program lasted 3 years, up from Nightingale's original 1 year. The curriculum included anatomy and physiology, pathology and disease processes, medical treatments and medication administration, surgical techniques and antiseptic practices, dietary requirements and feeding techniques, bandaging and wound care, record-keeping and documentation, and patient communication and ethical conduct. Examinations tested both theoretical knowledge and practical skills. A nurse might be asked to explain the pathology of pneumonia, demonstrate proper bandaging technique, calculate medication dosages, and show how to properly position a bedridden patient. Failure meant repeating portions of training or dismissal from the program. The hierarchy of trained nurses became more complex. At the top was the matron, or lady superintendent, the administrative head of nursing for an entire hospital. Under her were ward sisters, each managing a specific ward. Staff nurses did the hands-on patient care. Probationers, student nurses, learned under supervision. At the bottom were ward maids, who did cleaning and other menial tasks. This hierarchy created clear career progression, but also created distance between senior nurses and direct patient care. A newly promoted ward sister might find herself doing more paperwork and management and less actual nursing. Some welcomed this progression. Others missed the direct patient contact that drew them to nursing in the first place. Joke 5. The nursing career ladder was designed so that the reward for being good at patient care was promotion to a position with less patient care, which is either brilliant human resources management or a cosmic joke, depending on your perspective. Discipline within nursing ranks was strict. The ward sister could discipline staff nurses and probationers for infractions ranging from minor, being late for duty, to major, patient harm through negligence. Punishments included extra shifts, loss of free time, formal reprimands in the nurse's record, or dismissal. The goal was maintaining the profession's reputation and ensuring patient safety. The result was sometimes petty tyranny, where personality conflicts masqueraded as professional standards. But the system also protected nurses in some ways. The hierarchy meant nurses had advocates. A ward sister could defend her staff against unreasonable doctor demands or hospital administration overreach. The matron could protect nurses from patients' families who made inappropriate requests or accusations. The profession's growing organization gave nurses collective power they'd never had as individual servants. Nursing associations and unions began forming, though union was a dirty word that respectable nurses avoided. These organizations advocated for better pay, reasonable hours, improved working conditions, and professional recognition. They published journals, held conferences, and created networks where nurses could share knowledge and support each other. The British Nurses Association, the Royal British Nurses Association, and later the College of Nursing all worked to advance professional interests. The push for nurse registration, requiring nurses to be licensed by the government, became the dominant political issue in nursing by the 1890s. Supporters argued registration would protect the public from untrained imposters, raise professional standards, and give nurses legal recognition. Opponents, including, surprisingly, some prominent nurses, argued it would create bureaucracy, limit flexibility, and potentially exclude good nurses who learn through experience rather than formal training. Mainstream fact: the debate over nurse registration was fierce and personal. Florence Nightingale opposed compulsory registration, believing that character and calling were more important than passing examinations. Her opponents argued that without registration, anyone could call themselves a nurse, and patients had no way to distinguish trained professionals from incompetent frauds. Registration would eventually pass in 1919, long after Nightingale's death, showing how even the founder of modern nursing couldn't control her creation's evolution. Individual nurses made remarkable contributions beyond their daily ward work. Ethel Gordon Fenwick, later Mrs. Bedford Fenwick, led the registration campaign with passionate intensity, founding the British Nurses Association and editing the Nursing Record, later British Journal of Nursing. Rebecca Strong founded nursing training programs in Australia. Agnes Jones reformed workhouse infirmaries in Liverpool, bringing trained nursing to the poorest patients. These women, and hundreds like them, built the profession through determination, skill, and refusal to accept that nursing should remain a low-status occupation. But we shouldn't romanticize Victorian nursing too much. Yes, it became more professional and more effective, but it was still exhausting, poorly paid work performed almost entirely by women who had few other options. Nurses worked themselves into illness regularly. Tuberculosis, spread by constant patient contact, killed many nurses. Back injuries from lifting patients without modern equipment were common. Burnout was epidemic, though not called that yet. And nursing remained fundamentally gendered in ways that limited both nurses and medicine. The assumption that nursing was women's work because women were naturally caring and nurturing meant nursing was valued less than men's professional work. It also meant nursing was trapped in ideologies of feminine self-sacrifice that discouraged nurses from advocating for themselves. Male nurses existed, but were rare and usually worked in psychiatric settings where physical strength was prioritized. The ideal Nightingale nurse was supposed to embody Victorian feminine virtues: modest, obedient, self-sacrificing, pure, devoted to others' needs. But she also needed to be physically strong, intellectually sharp, capable of making life or death decisions, and able to assert authority over patients and junior staff. Reconciling these conflicting expectations was exhausting mental and emotional labor that no one acknowledged or compensated. Quirky tidbit: some hospitals posted mottos or prayers in nurses' quarters to inspire them. One popular verse read, "The trained nurse is one who can stand long hours without fatigue, the sight of blood without fainting, and the constant suffering of others without hardness of heart." This is either inspirational or a job description that should come with hazard pay and free therapy.
By 1900, nursing had been transformed. The drunk, untrained Gamp was largely historical, though she persisted in some workhouse infirmaries and small voluntary hospitals that couldn't afford trained staff. The trained, professional Nightingale nurse was the new standard, even if not every hospital fully achieved it. Patients benefited enormously. A sick person in 1900 received far better hospital care than their counterpart in 1850, and nursing reform was a major reason why. Better nutrition, better hygiene, better wound care, better symptom management — all these improvements came partly from medical advances, but mostly from better nursing. Yet, huge challenges remained. Nurse-to-patient ratios were still inadequate. One nurse might manage 20 or 30 patients in a ward, providing all their care with minimal support. Pay remained low. A trained nurse in 1900 might earn £30 to £40 per year, roughly $4,000 to $5,500 today, barely enough to support herself. Hours remained brutal. Working conditions, while better than before, were still difficult. And nursing still offered women limited alternatives. You could marry and leave nursing, or stay nursing and remain unmarried. You couldn't have both, not realistically. This forced choice meant nursing lost experienced practitioners when they married and discouraged women who wanted both career and family from entering the profession. Emma, our ward sister, lies in her bed in the nurse's home at night, too tired to sleep despite exhaustion. She thinks about the patient she lost today, the young mother who developed puerperal fever despite Emma's careful antiseptic protocols. She thinks about the probationer she had to discipline for a medication error. She thinks about the doctor who dismissed her observation that a patient's symptoms suggested appendicitis rather than simple indigestion. She was right, he was wrong. The patient needed emergency surgery. She thinks about whether she'll still be doing this in 10 years, in 20, whether the satisfaction of good work is enough compensation for everything she's given up, whether the profession she's devoted herself to will ever truly value that devotion. She doesn't have answers.
But tomorrow morning at 6 a.m., she'll get up and do it all again, because that's what nurses do. They show up. They do the work. They care for patients whether they're appreciated or not, paid fairly or not, recognized or not. And gradually, patient by patient, shift by shift, Victorian nurses transformed healthcare from something you survived despite medical treatment into something that might actually help you recover. That's worth something. That's worth a lot, actually. You're settling into hospital life, learning the ward rhythms, appreciating or tolerating the nursing care, and trying not to think too much about your missing leg. But now it's time to learn about the treatments you might receive for various ailments. And this is where Victorian medicine gets truly creative. By creative, I mean wildly experimental with your body as the canvas. Let's start with the classics, the treatments that defined Victorian medicine for generations before anyone thought to ask whether they actually worked. Bloodletting and leeches. Bloodletting is ancient. The Romans did it, medieval monks did it, and Victorians inherited it with the confidence of people who've never asked awkward questions about traditional practices. The theory behind bloodletting is humoral medicine. The body contains 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and illness results from imbalance. Too much blood? Take some out. It's simple mathematics applied to bodily fluids, which should have been the first warning sign. Victorian doctors still prescribe bloodletting for an impressive range of conditions: fevers, inflammation, apoplexy or stroke, congestion, headaches, and basically anything where the patient looks flushed or the doctor looks uncertain. The treatment involves making an incision in a vein, usually at the elbow, and letting blood flow into a basin until the doctor decides you've lost enough blood. How much is enough? That's where Victorian medicine gets inexact. Some doctors advocate taking until the patient nearly faints, operating on the principle that if a little bloodletting is good, a lot must be better. Others use measurement, a pint, sometimes more. The most enthusiastic practitioners might remove several pints over multiple sessions, creating anemia that somehow coexists with the treatment for the original problem. Joke 1, Victorian bloodletting can be summarized as, is the patient sick? Better drain their vital fluids. Did that make them weaker? That's probably just the illness being stubborn. Better drain more. It's circular reasoning that happens to be red and liquid. Mainstream fact: by the mid-Victorian period, bloodletting was falling out of favor among progressive doctors who'd noticed that patients often did better without it. The French physician Pierre Louis conducted statistical studies in the 1830s showing bloodletting didn't improve outcomes for pneumonia patients. But tradition dies hard, especially in medicine, and bloodletting persisted in some practices into the 1870s and beyond. Leeches are bloodletting's more specialized cousin. They're used for localized blood removal rather than general depletion. Hirdo medicinalis, the medicinal leech, is a slimy, segmented worm that attaches to skin, makes a small incision with its 3 rows of teeth, and sucks blood while injecting anticoagulants that keep the blood flowing. Victorian hospitals maintain leech jars, glass containers full of leeches stored in water waiting for their next meal. A leech prescription might call for 4 to 6 leeches applied to the affected area. The practitioner, nurse or doctor, places leeches on the patient's skin. The leeches attach and feed for 20 to 30 minutes, swelling to several times their original size. When satisfied, they drop off. The wounds continue bleeding for hours because of the anticoagulant, which is considered therapeutic. Additional bloodletting for free.
Leeches are applied to swollen joints, inflamed areas, bruises, around the eyes for various problems, behind the ears for headaches, on the temples for more headaches, on the abdomen for female troubles, and basically anywhere that seems problematic. Some patients find the sensation merely unpleasant. Others are horrified by having bloated worms attached to their body. The hospital staff considers this character building. Quirky tidbit. Hospitals had to hire leech boys, usually young apprentices, whose job was feeding and caring for the leech supply.
Leeches need regular blood meals to stay healthy, so leech boys would sometimes let leeches feed on their own arms. This was considered a perfectly reasonable job duty and not at all a sign that hospital employment practices needed examination. Mercury is Victorian medicine's favorite heavy metal, used to treat an astonishing range of conditions. Calomel, mercurous chloride, is prescribed for intestinal complaints, as a purgative, for syphilis, for inflammation, for fever, and as a general cure-all when doctors are stumped. The problem with mercury is that it's poisonous. Not if you take too much poisonous, if you take any poisonous. But Victorian dosing doesn't account for this. Patients are given mercury pills, mercury ointments, or mercury vapor treatments, sitting in a closed box while mercury is heated beneath, inhaling the fumes. Mercury poisoning produces distinctive symptoms: excessive salivation, patients drool constantly, tooth loss, swollen gums that bleed easily, tremors, kidney damage, and death if you really commit to the treatment. Doctors notice these symptoms and conclude either that the mercury is working, the excessive drooling means the body is expelling disease through saliva, or that the patient needs more mercury, or both. Mainstream fact: the phrase "mad as a hatter" comes from mercury poisoning affecting hat makers who used mercury in the felting process. The tremors, personality changes, and cognitive impairment caused by chronic mercury exposure were called hatter's shakes. That Victorian doctors continued prescribing mercury for patients despite observing identical symptoms shows the period's remarkable ability to ignore inconvenient evidence. Syphilis treatment particularly relies on mercury because nothing else seems to work. Patients with syphilis are given mercury until they develop mercury poisoning symptoms, then given more mercury because obviously the treatment needs to be stronger. Some patients survive both the syphilis and the treatment. Many don't. The treatment might be worse than the disease, but at least you tried something, which is Victorian medicine's unofficial motto. Purging and puking, medical terminology for deliberately causing diarrhea and vomiting, are standard treatments based on the theory that disease can be expelled from the body through aggressive emptying of the digestive system. Emetics, vomit-inducing drugs, and purgatives, diarrhea-inducing drugs, are prescribed with enthusiasm. Ipecac syrup induces vomiting. Castor oil induces diarrhea. Antimony compounds do both, which is considered efficient. Patients are given these substances and spend the next several hours being violently ill at both ends, which supposedly removes the disease, but definitely removes their dignity and any food they've eaten recently. Joke 2. Victorian medicine operated on the principle that if it doesn't come out on its own, we'll help it come out. Blood, vomit, diarrhea, pus, the Victorians viewed bodily fluids as problems seeking exit routes, and doctors as helpful doormen showing them the way. Opium and its derivatives are Victorian medicine's actual useful contribution to patient care. Laudanum, opium dissolved in alcohol, morphine, isolated from opium in 1804, and heroin, developed in 1874 and initially marketed as a non-addictive morphine substitute, are used for pain relief, cough suppression, diarrhea control, and keeping patients calm. These drugs actually work. They genuinely relieve pain and suffering. The problem is addiction, which Victorian doctors recognize but don't fully understand. Patients develop tolerance, need higher doses, experience withdrawal when stopped, and sometimes prioritize getting their opiate fix over all other concerns, including recovery. Hospitals are supposed to control opiate dispensing carefully, but in practice, regulation is loose. Patients can buy laudanum from any pharmacy without prescription. Patent medicines, tonics and elixirs sold with extravagant health claims, often contain opium or morphine without listing it on the label. Victorian Britain has an opiate problem. though it's not called that yet because addiction is viewed as a moral failing rather than a medical condition. Mainstream fact. By the 1890s, an estimated 1 in 400 people in Britain were addicted to opiates, with the problem particularly severe among middle and upper-class women who'd been prescribed laudanum for nervous complaints, and working-class people who used cheap opiate preparations to manage pain from industrial accidents or chronic disease. The Pharmacy Act of 1868 attempted to restrict opiate sales, but enforcement was patchy. Blistering is a treatment where the doctor deliberately creates second-degree burns on the patient's skin with caustic substances, cantharides or Spanish fly, or hot plasters. The theory is that creating artificial inflammation draws disease away from internal organs to the surface. The reality is that you're giving patients painful burns to treat their existing illness, creating a new problem rather than solving the old one. Blisters are applied to the chest for respiratory complaints, the back for kidney problems, the abdomen for digestive issues, and anywhere else that seems promising. The patient develops fluid-filled blisters that must be drained. More fluid coming out. Victorian doctors love this. The wounds take weeks to heal and frequently get infected because, remember, we're in the pre-antiseptic era for most of this period. Cupping is similar in theory to bloodletting but uses vacuum pressure instead of cutting. Glass cups are heated, creating vacuum as they cool, and applied to skin. The vacuum draws blood to the surface, creating circular bruises. Wet cupping involves making small cuts first so blood is actually drawn out. Dry cupping just bruises you impressively. Cupping is prescribed for congestion, pain, inflammation, and pretty much the same list as bloodletting because they're based on the same shaky theoretical foundation. Patients end up looking like they've been attacked by a very precise octopus. The circular bruises are sometimes pointed to as proof that treatment is working. See, we've drawn the bad humors to the surface. No, you've just bruised someone repeatedly.
Some Victorian patients became connoisseurs of cupping, claiming they could feel the difference between properly applied cups and amateur work. They'd request specific practitioners known for their cupping technique, which suggests either genuine variation in skill or powerful placebo effects, possibly both. Patent medicines are the Victorian equivalent of modern supplement scams. Bottles of mysterious liquid making extravagant claims about curing everything from consumption to cancer, usually containing opium, alcohol, cocaine, or mercury in various combinations. They have names like Dr. Hamlin's Wizard Oil, Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup, and cocaine toothache drops, which is at least honest about ingredients. Advertising for patent medicines is creative and shameless. Testimonials from satisfied customers, probably fictional, fill newspapers. Dramatic illustrations show healthy people transforming from decrepit invalids after using the product. Claims include curing consumption, tuberculosis, cancer, kidney disease, heart conditions, and anything else patients fear. The Victorian equivalent of "doctors hate this one weird trick" fills pages of print media. Mainstream fact. The patent medicine industry was worth millions of pounds annually by the late Victorian period. Regulation was minimal. The Pharmacy Act of 1868 required labeling of dangerous substances, but didn't stop manufacturers from adding cocaine or morphine to products marketed for children. The British Medical Association finally began systematically testing and exposing fraudulent patent medicines in the early 1900s. But too late for thousands of patients who'd wasted money and delayed proper treatment. Quack doctors thrive in this environment. Any charlatan with confidence and a medical-sounding title can set up practice selling miracle cures. Some are relatively harmless. They sell sugar pills and positive thinking. Others are actively dangerous. They perform unnecessary surgeries, prescribe poisonous treatments, or convince patients to abandon legitimate care for their worthless alternatives. Distinguishing legitimate doctors from quacks is difficult for patients. Both wear professional clothing, use medical terminology, display diplomas, real or purchased from diploma mills, and charge fees. The main difference is that legitimate doctors are wrong using accepted medical theories, while quacks are wrong using their own invented medical theories. From the patient's perspective, the outcomes are disappointingly similar. Some quack treatments become fashionable. Electrotherapy uses electric current applied to the body to treat paralysis, pain, depression, and impotence. It sometimes works through placebo effect, sometimes just provides mild shocks that achieve nothing. Hydrotherapy prescribes various water treatments, baths, showers, wraps, based on the theory that water temperature and pressure can rebalance the body. Some hydrotherapy is actually relaxing and helpful. Some is just expensive bathing. Medical galvanism applies electric current to stimulate muscles and nerves. This has legitimate uses, later developed into modern TENS units, but Victorian practitioners apply it to everything, whether appropriate or not. Joke 3. Victorian medical logic insisted that if sticking electricity into a patient didn't help, you probably weren't using enough electricity. The dial goes up to 11, and someone will eventually try 12, just to be thorough. Dietary treatments are big business. John Harvey Kellogg, American but influential in Britain, runs a sanitarium promoting cereal-based diets, extensive chewing, each bite chewed 40 times, and elimination of spices, meat, and anything flavorful. His theory is that bland food prevents moral and physical corruption. His cornflakes are originally designed as anti-masturbatory breakfast food, which tells you everything about Victorian medical priorities. Other dietary fads include the Salisbury diet, mostly ground beef, prescribed for almost everything, the grape cure, eat only grapes for weeks to cleanse, the milk diet, drink several quarts of milk daily, and various vegetarian and raw food movements. Some of these approaches have legitimate health benefits. Some are just different ways to be malnourished while believing you're being healthy. Tonics are prescribed to strengthen weak patients. These are usually alcohol-based preparations with various additions: iron for anemia, cod liver oil for general debility, beef extract for weakness, and quinine for fever. Some actually help. Iron does treat anemia. Cod liver oil provides vitamin D. Others are expensive placebos. The line between medicine and food supplement is fuzzy. Plasters and poultices are applied externally to treat internal problems through the skin. A mustard plaster, mustard powder mixed with flour and water, spread on cloth, applied to chest, is standard treatment for pneumonia and bronchitis. It creates a burning sensation and redness, which is believed to draw out congestion. Actually, it just burns your skin while you continue having pneumonia. Bread and milk poultices are applied to infected wounds, linseed poultices for inflammation, charcoal poultices for absorbing poison. The theoretical basis is vague, but the applications are many. Patients spend significant time with various gooey substances plastered to their bodies, achieving little, except perhaps keeping them warm through sheer insulation. Mainstream fact: poultices occasionally helped by providing warmth and moisture to affected areas. Warm, moist compresses can relieve pain and improve circulation. But Victorian practitioners attributed this to the specific ingredients, mustard, linseed, bread, rather than the warmth and moisture, leading to increasingly complex and ultimately pointless recipes. Surgical treatments beyond actual surgery include cauterization, burning tissue with hot irons to seal injuries or destroy abnormal growths. This actually worked for some purposes, stopping bleeding, removing warts, but was also applied inappropriately because Victorian doctors had hammers, and every problem looked like a nail that needed burning. Scarification, making multiple small cuts in the skin to release bad blood or allow disease to escape. This is bloodletting's fussy cousin, who insists on doing things differently but achieves the same questionable results. Victorian medical logic insisted that if sticking electricity into a patient didn't help, you probably weren't using enough electricity. The dial goes up to 11, and someone will eventually try 12 just to be thorough. Dietary treatments are big business. John Harvey Kellogg, American but influential in Britain, runs a sanitarium promoting cereal-based diets, extensive chewing, each bite chewed 40 times, and elimination of spices, meat, and anything flavorful. His theory is that bland food prevents moral and physical corruption. His cornflakes are originally designed as anti-masturbatory breakfast food, which tells you everything about Victorian medical priorities. Other dietary fads include the Salisbury diet, mostly ground beef, prescribed for almost everything, the grape cure, eat only grapes for weeks to cleanse, the milk diet, drink several quarts of milk daily, and various vegetarian and raw food movements. Some of these approaches have legitimate health benefits. Some are just different ways to be malnourished while believing you're being healthy. Tonics are prescribed to strengthen weak patients. These are usually alcohol-based preparations with various additions: iron for anemia, cod liver oil for general debility, beef extract for weakness, and quinine for fever. Some actually help. Iron does treat anemia. Cod liver oil provides vitamin D. Others are expensive placebos. The line between medicine and food supplement is fuzzy. Plasters and poultices are applied externally to treat internal problems through the skin. A mustard plaster, mustard powder mixed with flour and water, spread on cloth, applied to chest, is standard treatment for pneumonia and bronchitis. It creates a burning sensation and redness, which is believed to draw out congestion. Actually, it just burns your skin while you continue having pneumonia. Bread and milk poultices are applied to infected wounds. Linseed poultices for inflammation, charcoal poultices for absorbing poison. The theoretical basis is vague, but the applications are many. Patients spend significant time with various gooey substances plastered to their bodies, achieving little except perhaps keeping them warm through sheer insulation. Mainstream fact: poultices occasionally helped by providing warmth and moisture to affected areas. Warm, moist compresses can relieve pain and improve circulation. But Victorian practitioners attributed this to the specific ingredients, mustard, linseed, or bread, rather than the warmth and moisture, leading to increasingly complex and ultimately pointless recipes. Surgical treatments beyond actual surgery include cauterization, burning tissue with hot irons to seal injuries or destroy abnormal growths. This actually worked for some purposes, like stopping bleeding, removing warts, but was also applied inappropriately because Victorian doctors had hammers and every problem looked like a nail that needed burning. Scarification, making multiple small cuts in the skin to release bad blood or allow disease to escape, is bloodletting's fussy cousin who insists on doing things differently but achieves the same questionable results.
Seton insertion. Threading silk through a fold of skin to maintain drainage of disease. The silk stays in place for weeks or months, creating a persistent wound that's supposed to help somehow. Unsurprisingly, it usually just gets infected. Trepanation. Drilling holes in the skull to relieve pressure or release evil spirits, depending on whether your surgeon is modern or traditional. This is ancient treatment that some Victorian surgeons still attempt, though increasingly rarely as understanding of the brain improves and people notice that drilling holes in skulls frequently kills patients. Quirky tidbit: some hospitals kept trepanning kits with various sized skull drills, although by the late Victorian period these were mainly used for training or museum displays rather than actual patient treatment. Possessing the tools to drill into people's heads apparently conveyed medical authority even if you never actually used them. Spiritual and psychological treatments occupy an interesting space between medicine and religion. Prayer is prescribed alongside medication, hospitals employ chaplains, and religious sisters often serve as nurses in Catholic hospitals. For many patients, spiritual comfort is more effective than medical treatment because it addresses fear and suffering that medicine can't touch. Hysteria treatments, we discussed these earlier, combine physical intervention, massage, hydrotherapy, electrical stimulation, with psychological approaches, rest cures, talking cures, and in the 1890s, early psychoanalysis. The effectiveness varies wildly depending on the practitioner and what's actually wrong with the patient. Moral treatment for mental illness, we'll cover this more in the asylum section, attempts to cure insanity through routine, occupation, and kind treatment, rather than restraints and punishment. It's remarkably progressive for the era, though implementation varies from enlightened to neglectful with good intentions. As the Victorian period progresses, medical treatment slowly becomes more scientific and less theoretical. The acceptance of germ theory in the 1880s and 90s revolutionizes understanding of infection and hygiene. Anesthesia makes surgery more precise. Antiseptic and aseptic techniques reduce mortality. Diagnostic tools improve. Thermometers become standard for measuring fever, stethoscopes for listening to hearts and lungs, X-rays from 1895 for seeing inside the body. But progress is uneven. Advanced hospitals in London might embrace antiseptic techniques, while rural hospitals continue bloodletting. Progressive doctors abandon mercury, while traditional practitioners defend it. Evidence-based medicine competes with tradition, authority, and profit motives. The pharmaceutical industry develops alongside medical practice, producing standardized medications with known potencies. This is a significant improvement over the previous system where every pharmacist mixed their own preparations with variable strengths. But it also creates opportunities for exploitation. Pharmaceutical companies market expensive patented drugs that aren't necessarily better than cheaper alternatives.
But Victorian cholera treatment is initially useless or harmful. Bloodletting, because removing more fluids from already dehydrated patients is logical. Mercury, opium, castor oil, more diarrhea, helpful, and brandy. Doctors try everything except the one thing that actually works: clean water replacement. Mainstream fact: London suffered major cholera outbreaks in 1832, 1848-49, 1854, and 1866. The 1854 outbreak is famous for Dr. John Snow's investigation, which traced infections to a contaminated water pump on Broad Street. Snow's work proved cholera spread through water, not through miasma, bad air, as most doctors believed. His evidence eventually led to major sanitation improvements, though getting Victorians to accept that their drinking water was full of sewage required remarkable persuasion. Cholera doesn't discriminate by class. It kills rich and poor alike, which is probably the only reason Parliament eventually funded sewer systems. When diseases only kill poor people, they're tragic but tolerable. When they kill barristers and merchants, they're public health emergencies requiring immediate infrastructure investment. The class dimension of cholera response is darkly comic. Poor neighborhoods with contaminated wells and no sanitation suffer first and worst. Middle-class reformers write concerned letters to newspapers. Wealthy families flee to the countryside. Government committees meet to discuss theories and assign blame. Only when cholera appears in respectable districts does action become urgent. The Great Stink of 1858, when unusually hot weather made the Thames smell so terrible that Parliament couldn't meet, finally convinced legislators to fund Joseph Balzaget's sewer system. Balzaget designed an engineering marvel, 82 miles of underground brick sewers that would intercept sewage before it reached the Thames and carry it downstream. Construction took years, cost millions, and saved countless lives by separating drinking water from wastewater. Victorian public health policy operated on the principle that problems affecting only poor people were moral failures requiring sermons, while problems affecting rich people were infrastructure failures requiring engineers. Apparently, class determined whether you needed a lecture or a sewer system. Typhoid fever is cholera's less dramatic but equally dangerous cousin. Like cholera, it spreads through contaminated water and food, particularly through the famous typhoid Mary route, asymptomatic carriers who work as cooks. Symptoms develop slowly: rising fever, headache, abdominal pain, rose-colored spots on the chest, and eventually delirium and possible intestinal perforation.
Typhoid mortality is around 10 to 20% with decent supportive care, higher without. Treatment consists mainly of keeping patients hydrated, managing fever, and hoping. Doctors prescribe various drugs, quinine, mercury, opium, that don't actually affect the bacterial infection, but might help manage symptoms. Quirky tidbit: Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's beloved husband, died of typhoid in 1861. His death shocked the nation and made typhoid fashionable in a morbid way. Suddenly, it wasn't just a working-class disease, but something that could strike the highest families. This led to increased interest in prevention, though implementation remained patchy. Tuberculosis, also called consumption, phthisis, or the White Plague, is the Victorian era's biggest killer, responsible for roughly 1 in 7 deaths. It's a bacterial infection primarily affecting the lungs, though it can infect bones, joints, skin, and other organs. Unlike cholera's dramatic, acute illness, tuberculosis is a slow killer that can take months or years. Symptoms include chronic cough with bloody sputum, weight loss, hence consumption, it consumes you, fever, night sweats, fatigue, and a peculiar flushed appearance that some Victorians romanticize as beautiful. Poets and artists describe consumptive heroines as ethereally lovely in their decline, which is deeply offensive to people actually coughing up blood. TB spreads through airborne droplets when infected people cough or sneeze. Close quarters, poor ventilation, and malnutrition accelerate transmission. Urban slums, workhouses, factories, and hospitals are all excellent TB breeding grounds. The disease particularly affects young adults, killing them in their prime productive years. Mainstream fact: tuberculosis killed approximately 60,000 people per year in England and Wales during the mid-Victorian period. It was so common that having at least one family member die of TB was considered normal. Entire families could be wiped out as infection passed from one member to another. The disease showed some class bias. Overcrowding and poor nutrition in working-class housing increased risk, but it killed across the economic spectrum. Treatment for TB is simultaneously sensible and useless. Doctors prescribe rest in well-ventilated rooms, helps. Good nutrition, helps. Fresh air, helps. Moving to a better climate, maybe helps, mostly just exports the problem. Medications include cod liver oil, provides calories and vitamins, various tonics, and eventually creosote, which doesn't work but smells terrible, adding insult to illness. The sanatorium movement develops in the late Victorian period, establishing specialized hospitals in rural or mountainous areas with supposedly healthful climates. Patients spend months or years resting, eating well, and breathing fresh air, while their bodies either fight off the infection or succumb to it. Sanatoriums work for some patients probably because rest and good nutrition support immune function, not because mountain air has magical properties. Advanced TB requires more aggressive intervention. Doctors try pneumothorax therapy, deliberately collapsing the infected lung to rest it. This sometimes worked. Surgical removal of infected tissue, risky in pre-antibiotic era, and various injections of mysterious substances that accomplish nothing but adding to patient suffering. Quirky tidbit: TB's romantic image, the beautiful invalid, the tragic artist dying young, persisted despite the reality of coughing up blood, wasting away, and dying slowly. La Bohème, La Dame de Camelier, and dozens of other Victorian works feature consumptive characters whose picturesque deaths bore little resemblance to the actual experience. Real TB patients found this romanticization insulting, but dead people can't write book reviews.
Smallpox is an ancient disease that vaccination was slowly defeating during the Victorian era, though not without resistance. Pre-vaccination mortality was around 30%, with survivors often left blind, scarred, or disfigured. The disease caused fever, distinctive pustular rash, and sometimes hemorrhagic complications. Edward Jenner developed vaccination using cowpox, a related but milder disease, in 1796. By the Victorian period, vaccination was available but not universally accepted. The Vaccination Act of 1853 made infant vaccination compulsory, leading to a fierce backlash from people who objected on medical grounds — vaccines occasionally cause complications — Religious grounds, interfering with God's will, or civil liberties grounds, government shouldn't mandate medical procedures. The anti-vaccination movement developed organized opposition, holding rallies, publishing pamphlets, and occasionally rioting. Leicester became famous for rejecting compulsory vaccination in favor of isolation and sanitation, which somewhat worked, though not as well as vaccination. The debate consumed Victorian politics and medical ethics. Mainstream fact: despite resistance, vaccination significantly reduced smallpox deaths. England and Wales had 42,000 smallpox deaths in the 1837-40 period. By 1898-1900, deaths had fallen to around 2,000 annually despite population growth. This success story demonstrated that prevention could work when treatment couldn't, a lesson that slowly permeated Victorian medical thinking. Scarlet fever is particularly dangerous to children, causing high fever, distinctive red rash, and potentially fatal complications, including kidney damage and rheumatic heart disease. It spreads easily through close contact and contaminated items. Victorian families might lose multiple children in a single outbreak. Treatment is supportive, keeping fever down, ensuring hydration, preventing secondary infections, impossible without antibiotics, and praying. Quarantine helps prevent spread, so affected families might be isolated for weeks, with health officials posting quarantine notices on their doors. This prevents disease transmission, but also creates economic disaster for working families who can't earn income while quarantined. Diphtheria causes throat swelling that can literally suffocate victims, particularly children. The disease creates a gray membrane across the throat that blocks breathing. Treatment options are limited. Trying to mechanically remove the membrane, dangerous. Tracheotomy to bypass the obstruction, also dangerous. And supportive care, inadequate. Antitoxin treatment develops in the 1890s, one of Victorian medicine's genuine triumphs. Scientists discovered that injecting antibodies from immunized horses dramatically improves survival rates. This is actual modern medicine emerging from Victorian trial and error. Unfortunately, it arrives very late in the period, so most Victorian children with diphtheria still die. Whooping cough, pertussis, is another childhood killer, causing violent coughing fits that can last weeks. The characteristic whoop sound when gasping for air between coughs gives the disease its name. Infants and young children can die from complications including pneumonia, seizures, or simply exhaustion from constant coughing. Treatment consists of trying to suppress coughing, doesn't work very well, keeping patients warm and fed, helps somewhat, and avoiding anything that triggers coughing fits. Good luck with that. Various folk remedies circulate, carrying the child to a gasworks to breathe coal gas fumes, taking them through a railway tunnel, passing them through a horse collar, none of which help and some of which add carbon monoxide poisoning to the list of problems. Joke 2. Victorian parents with a whooping cough child were told to try medicine, useless, prayer, comforting but not curative, fresh air, sensible, or carrying the child through a tunnel while a horse coughs on them, surprisingly popular despite being obviously insane. Evidence-based medicine was still finding its footing. Puerperal fever, childbed fever, kills new mothers by the thousands. After delivery, women develop infection in the uterus that quickly spreads to the bloodstream. Symptoms include fever, abdominal pain, foul discharge, and within days, death from septicemia. The cause is bacteria introduced during delivery by contaminated hands, instruments, or materials. Dr. Ignace Semmelweis proved in the 1840s that hand washing with chlorinated lime solution dramatically reduced mortality. But his ideas were rejected by most physicians, who found it insulting to suggest their hands could cause harm. Doctors have clean hands by definition because they're gentlemen, never mind that they just did an autopsy without washing. Mainstream fact: maternal mortality from puerperal fever in some Victorian hospitals reached 25% or higher. Women literally had better survival chances giving birth at home, attended by midwives, than in hospitals attended by doctors. This horrific statistic only improved after antiseptic practices were finally adopted in the 1880s and 90s.
The delay cost tens of thousands of lives, killed by medical pride and refusal to accept evidence. The transition to antiseptic obstetrics is agonizingly slow. Ignace Semmelweis, 1847, proves hand-washing works. Oliver Wendell Holmes, 1843, independently reaches the same conclusion. Most doctors ignore both, and women continued dying. Joseph Lister, 1860s, demonstrates antiseptic surgery success. Some obstetricians adopt his methods, most don't. Only by the 1880s does antiseptic obstetrics become standard, and puerperal fever mortality finally falls dramatically. The delay cost tens of thousands of lives, killed by medical pride and refusal to accept evidence. Measles, mumps, and rubella, the childhood diseases we now prevent with vaccines, kill or disable thousands of Victorian children. These aren't the minor inconveniences modern parents associate them with. Measles can cause pneumonia, encephalitis, and death. Mumps can cause deafness. Rubella can cause birth defects if pregnant women are infected. No specific treatments exist, just supportive care and hope. Families watch children suffer through these illnesses, knowing some will die and there's nothing to be done except keep them comfortable and wait. The fatalism this creates, expecting to lose children to disease, shapes Victorian parent-child relationships in ways that are heartbreaking. Dysentery and diarrheal diseases kill through dehydration, particularly affecting children and elderly people. Contaminated water, milk, and food spread bacterial and parasitic infections that cause bloody diarrhea, abdominal cramps, and fluid loss. In workhouses, prisons, and slums where sanitation is terrible and water is contaminated, dysentery outbreaks are routine.
Smallpox is an ancient disease that vaccination was slowly defeating during the Victorian era, though not without resistance. Pre-vaccination mortality was around 30%, with survivors often left blind, scarred, or disfigured. The disease caused fever, distinctive pustular rash, and sometimes hemorrhagic complications. Edward Jenner developed vaccination using cowpox, a related but milder disease, in 1796. By the Victorian period, vaccination was available but not universally accepted. The Vaccination Act of 1853 made infant vaccination compulsory, leading to a fierce backlash from people who objected on medical grounds. Vaccines occasionally caused complications. Religious grounds, interfering with God's will, or civil liberties grounds, government shouldn't mandate medical procedures. The anti-vaccination movement developed organized opposition, holding rallies, publishing pamphlets, and occasionally rioting. Leicester became famous for rejecting compulsory vaccination in favor of isolation and sanitation, which somewhat worked, though not as well as vaccination. The debate consumed Victorian politics and medical ethics. Mainstream fact: despite resistance, vaccination significantly reduced smallpox deaths. England and Wales had 42,000 smallpox deaths in the 1837-40 period. By 1898-1900, deaths had fallen to around 2,000 annually despite population growth. This success story demonstrated that prevention could work when treatment couldn't, a lesson that slowly permeated Victorian medical thinking. Scarlet fever is particularly dangerous to children, causing high fever, distinctive red rash, and potentially fatal complications including kidney damage and rheumatic heart disease. It spreads easily through close contact and contaminated items. Victorian families might lose multiple children in a single outbreak. Treatment is supportive, keeping fever down, ensuring hydration, preventing secondary infections, impossible without antibiotics, and praying. Quarantine helps prevent spread, so affected families might be isolated for weeks, with health officials posting quarantine notices on their doors. This prevents disease transmission, but also creates economic disaster for working families who can't earn income while quarantined. Diphtheria causes throat swelling that can literally suffocate victims, particularly children. The disease creates a gray membrane across the throat that blocks breathing. Treatment options are limited. Trying to mechanically remove the membrane, dangerous. Tracheotomy to bypass the obstruction, also dangerous. And supportive care, inadequate. Antitoxin treatment develops in the 1890s, one of Victorian medicine's genuine triumphs. Scientists discover that injecting antibodies from immunized horses dramatically improves survival rates. This is actual modern medicine emerging from Victorian trial and error. Unfortunately, it arrives very late in the period, so most Victorian children with diphtheria still die. Joke 2. Victorian parents with a whooping cough child were told to try medicine, useless, prayer, comforting but not curative, fresh air, sensible, or carrying the child through a tunnel while a horse coughs on them, surprisingly popular despite being obviously insane. Evidence-based medicine was still finding its footing. Puerperal fever, childbed fever, kills new mothers by the thousands. After delivery, women develop infection in the uterus that quickly spreads to the bloodstream. Symptoms include fever, abdominal pain, foul discharge, and within days, death from septicemia. The cause is bacteria introduced during delivery by contaminated hands, instruments, or materials. Dr. Ignaz Semmelweis proved in the 1840s that hand washing with chlorinated lime solution dramatically reduced mortality. But his ideas were rejected by most physicians who found it insulting to suggest their hands could cause harm. Doctors have clean hands by definition because they're gentlemen. Never mind that they just did an autopsy without washing. Mainstream fact. Maternal mortality from puerperal fever in some Victorian hospitals reached 25% or higher. Women literally had better survival chances giving birth at home, attended by midwives, than in hospitals attended by doctors. This horrific statistic only improved after antiseptic practices were finally adopted in the 1880s and 90s. The delay cost tens of thousands of lives, killed by medical pride and refusal to accept evidence. The transition to antiseptic obstetrics is agonizingly slow. Ignaz Semmelweis proves hand washing works. Oliver Wendell Holmes, 1843, independently reaches the same conclusion. Most doctors ignore both, and women continue dying. Joseph Lister, 1860s, demonstrates antiseptic surgery success. Some obstetricians adopt his methods, most don't. Only by the 1880s does antiseptic obstetrics become standard, and puerperal fever mortality finally falls dramatically. Measles, mumps, and rubella, the childhood diseases we now prevent with vaccines, kill or disable thousands of Victorian children. These aren't the minor inconveniences modern parents associate with them. Measles can cause pneumonia, encephalitis, and death. Mumps can cause deafness. Rubella causes birth defects if pregnant women are infected. No specific treatments exist, just supportive care and hope. Families watch children suffer through these illnesses, knowing some will die and there's nothing to be done except keep them comfortable and wait. This fatalism, this expecting to lose children to disease, shapes Victorian parent-child relationships in ways that are heartbreaking. Dysentery and diarrheal diseases kill through dehydration, particularly affecting children and elderly people. Contaminated water, milk, and food spread bacterial and parasitic infections that cause bloody diarrhea, abdominal cramps, and fluid loss. In workhouses, prisons, and slums where sanitation is terrible and water is contaminated, dysentery outbreaks are routine.
Leeches are applied to swollen joints, inflamed areas, bruises, around the eyes for various problems, behind the ears for headaches, on the temples for more headaches, on the abdomen for female troubles, and basically anywhere that seems problematic. Some patients find the sensation merely unpleasant. Others are horrified by having bloated worms attached to their body. The hospital staff considers this character building. Quirky tidbit. Hospitals had to hire leech boys, usually young apprentices, whose job was feeding and caring for the leech supply. Leeches need regular blood meals to stay healthy, so leech boys would sometimes let leeches feed on their own arms. This was considered a perfectly reasonable job duty and not at all a sign that hospital employment practices needed examination. Mercury is Victorian medicine's favorite heavy metal, used to treat an astonishing range of conditions. Calomel, mercurous chloride, is prescribed for intestinal complaints, as a purgative, for syphilis, for inflammation, for fever, and as a general cure-all when doctors are stumped. The problem with mercury is that it's poisonous. Not if you take too much poisonous, if you take any poisonous. But Victorian dosing doesn't account for this. Patients are given mercury pills, mercury ointments, or mercury vapor treatments, sitting in a closed box while mercury is heated beneath, inhaling the fumes. Mercury poisoning produces distinctive symptoms: excessive salivation, patients drool constantly, tooth loss, swollen gums that bleed easily, tremors, kidney damage, and death if you really commit to the treatment. Doctors notice these symptoms and conclude either that the mercury is working, the excessive drooling means the body is expelling disease through saliva, or that the patient needs more mercury, or both. Mainstream fact: the phrase "mad as a hatter" comes from mercury poisoning affecting hat makers who used mercury in the felting process. The tremors, personality changes, and cognitive impairment caused by chronic mercury exposure were called hatter's shakes. That Victorian doctors continued prescribing mercury for patients despite observing identical symptoms shows the period's remarkable ability to ignore inconvenient evidence. Syphilis treatment particularly relies on mercury because nothing else seems to work. Patients with syphilis are given mercury until they develop mercury poisoning symptoms, then given more mercury because obviously the treatment needs to be stronger. Some patients survive both the syphilis and the treatment. Many don't. The treatment might be worse than the disease, but at least you tried something, which is Victorian medicine's unofficial motto. Purging and puking, medical terminology for deliberately causing diarrhea and vomiting, are standard treatments based on the theory that disease can be expelled from the body through aggressive emptying of the digestive system. Emetics, vomit-inducing drugs, and purgatives, diarrhea-inducing drugs, are prescribed with enthusiasm. Ipecac syrup induces vomiting. Castor oil induces diarrhea. Antimony compounds do both, which is considered efficient. Patients are given these substances and spend the next several hours being violently ill at both ends, which supposedly removes the disease, but definitely removes their dignity and any food they've eaten recently. Joke 2. Victorian medicine operated on the principle that if it doesn't come out on its own, we'll help it come out. Blood, vomit, diarrhea, pus, the Victorians viewed bodily fluids as problems seeking exit routes, and doctors as helpful doormen showing them the way. Opium and its derivatives are Victorian medicine's actual useful contribution to patient care. Laudanum, opium dissolved in alcohol, morphine, isolated from opium in 1804, and heroin, developed in 1874 and initially marketed as a non-addictive morphine substitute, are used for pain relief, cough suppression, diarrhea control, and keeping patients calm. These drugs actually work. They genuinely relieve pain and suffering. The problem is addiction, which Victorian doctors recognize but don't fully understand. Patients develop tolerance, need higher doses, experience withdrawal when stopped, and sometimes prioritize getting their opiate fix over all other concerns, including recovery. Hospitals are supposed to control opiate dispensing carefully, but in practice, regulation is loose. Patients can buy laudanum from any pharmacy without prescription. Patent medicines, tonics and elixirs sold with extravagant health claims, often contain opium or morphine without listing it on the label. Victorian Britain has an opiate problem, though it's not called that yet because addiction is viewed as a moral failing rather than a medical condition. Mainstream fact: by the 1890s, an estimated 1 in 400 people in Britain were addicted to opiates, with the problem particularly severe among middle and upper-class women who'd been prescribed laudanum for nervous complaints, and working-class people who used cheap opiate preparations to manage pain from industrial accidents or chronic disease. The Pharmacy Act of 1868 attempted to restrict opiate sales, but enforcement was patchy. Blistering is a treatment where the doctor deliberately creates second-degree burns on the patient's skin with caustic substances, cantharides or Spanish fly, or hot plasters. The theory is that creating artificial inflammation draws disease away from internal organs to the surface. The reality is that you're giving patients painful burns to treat their existing illness, creating a new problem rather than solving the old one. Blisters are applied to the chest for respiratory complaints, the back for kidney problems, the abdomen for digestive issues, and anywhere else that seems promising. The patient develops fluid-filled blisters that must be drained. More fluid coming out. Victorian doctors love this. The wounds take weeks to heal and frequently get infected because, remember, we're in the pre-antiseptic era for most of this period. Cupping is similar in theory to bloodletting, but uses vacuum pressure instead of cutting. Glass cups are heated, creating vacuum as they cool, and applied to skin. The vacuum draws blood to the surface, creating circular bruises. Wet cupping involves making small cuts first, so blood is actually drawn out. Dry cupping just bruises you impressively. Cupping is prescribed for congestion, pain, inflammation, and pretty much the same list as bloodletting because they're based on the same shaky theoretical foundation. Patients end up looking like they've been attacked by a very precise octopus. The circular bruises are sometimes pointed to as proof that treatment is working. See, we've drawn the bad humors to the surface. No, you've just bruised someone repeatedly.
We'll visit the Victorian Asylum, where mental illness is treated with methods ranging from progressive to horrifying, often simultaneously. But for tonight, rest in your hospital bed, grateful that you have merely a surgical amputation to recover from, rather than cholera, tuberculosis, or any of the other diseases that filled Victorian hospitals and graveyards. The night nurse makes her rounds, checking pulses, adjusting pillows, ensuring everyone has water within reach. The ward settles into its nighttime symphony of coughs, snores, and quiet suffering. Another day survived in the Victorian hospital, which is genuinely an achievement worth celebrating. Sleep if you can. The diseases wait for no one, but they can't touch you while you're dreaming of a future where antibiotics exist and bacterial infection doesn't mean probable death. Morning comes with its usual insistence, and today we're leaving the General Hospital behind for a different kind of Victorian medical institution, the asylum. Pack your things, not that you have many, say goodbye to Emma and the ward sister, and let's visit where Victorian society sent its mad, melancholic, and mentally disordered. The Victorian asylum occupies a strange space in medical history, simultaneously representing progressive reform, treating mental illness as medical rather than moral failure, and horrific institutionalization, warehousing inconvenient people in overcrowded facilities with inadequate care. Which version you encountered depended on timing, location, wealth, and luck. Let's start with where the asylum system comes from. Before the Victorian era, mentally ill people without families to care for them might end up in workhouses, prisons, or private madhouses, profit-making enterprises where families paid to have inconvenient relatives confined. Treatment ranged from neglect to active abuse. Patients were chained, beaten, starved, and displayed to curious visitors who paid to observe lunatics for entertainment. The York Retreat, founded by Quaker William Tuke in 1796, pioneered moral treatment, caring for mentally ill patients with kindness, occupation, and routine rather than restraints and punishment. This radical idea slowly influenced British asylum practice, though implementation was uneven. The County Asylums Act of 1808 encouraged counties to build public asylums for pauper lunatics. The process was slow. By 1850, only about half of English counties had public asylums, but the principle was established. Society had responsibility for providing care, and mental illness should be treated medically rather than punitively. Mainstream fact: the Victorian asylum system expanded dramatically throughout the 19th century. In 1850, England and Wales had approximately 7,000 asylum beds. By 1900, this had grown to over 100,000. This increase reflected both growing population and changing attitudes about institutionalization. Families and communities who previously cared for mentally ill members increasingly committed them to asylums, partly because asylum care improved, and partly because industrial economy made home care of disabled family members more difficult. You approach your asylum. Let's say it's a county asylum built in the 1860s, representing mid-Victorian progressive design. The building is impressive from outside. Gothic Revival architecture with towers, elaborate stonework, and extensive grounds. Victorian asylum architecture deliberately conveys institutional authority while supposedly providing therapeutic environment.
The building sits in countryside, surrounded by farmland that asylum patients work as part of therapeutic occupation. Fresh air, exercise, and productive labor are considered healing. Also convenient that patient labor makes asylums cheaper to operate, but we'll pretend that's purely coincidental therapeutic benefit. You enter through the admissions office, where a medical superintendent interviews you, or more likely interviews whoever's committing you, since you might not be capable of coherent conversation. The superintendent determines whether you're suitable for asylum admission. Criteria include being deemed insane by medical certificate, being unable to care for yourself, being dangerous to yourself or others, or simply being inconvenient to your family in ways they describe as insanity. Victorian psychiatric diagnosis is creative. Official categories include mania, melancholia, monomania, insanity focused on single subject, dementia, idiocy, general paralysis of the insane, actually late-stage syphilis affecting the brain, and moral insanity, basically behaving badly. Under these broad categories, almost any behavior can be pathologized. Women are committed for postpartum depression, sexual impropriety, or simply disagreeing with husbands too vigorously. Quirky tidbit: asylum admission records list fascinating causes of insanity that reflect Victorian anxieties more than medical science. Overstudy, reading too much. Religious excitement, being too enthusiastic about church. Domestic trouble, marital problems. Intemperance, drinking. Self-abuse, masturbation, always masturbation. And disappointment, unspecified life setbacks. One patient was admitted for novel reading, suggesting that Victorian doctors viewed books as genuinely dangerous to mental health. After admission, you're assigned to a ward based on your condition's severity and your wealth. Private-paying patients get better accommodations than pauper patients. The asylum follows the separate system. Men and women occupy different wings, different classes of patients are segregated, and acute cases are separated from chronic ones. Your ward is large, perhaps 40 to 60 beds, arranged in a long gallery with windows overlooking the grounds. The aesthetic is institutional. High ceilings, lots of light, natural light is considered therapeutic, minimal furniture, anything portable could become a weapon in agitated patients' hands, and constant observation. Privacy is non-existent. Dignity is optional. The daily routine begins at 6 a.m. Attendants wake patients, supervise dressing. Some patients require assistance, others just require watching to ensure they don't harm themselves.
Breakfast follows. Porridge, bread, tea, eaten in a communal dining hall under supervision. Table manners aren't required, but violence is discouraged. After breakfast comes the first occupation session. Victorian asylum treatment revolves around occupation therapy, keeping patients busy with productive work that supposedly calms disordered minds. Men do farm work, carpentry, shoemaking, or maintenance. Women do laundry, sewing, knitting, or domestic work. The therapeutic value is debatable, but the economic value to the asylum is significant. Patient labor significantly reduces operating costs. Joke 1. Victorian asylum occupation therapy was revolutionary in treating patients as capable humans needing meaningful activity, rather than animals needing restraint. It was also suspiciously convenient that this therapeutic work happened to involve laundry, farming, and maintenance that would otherwise require paid staff. Amazing how therapy and profit can align so perfectly. Some patients enjoy occupation. It provides purpose, breaks up monotony, and allows them to contribute. Others resent unpaid labor disguised as treatment. Those too disturbed to work safely are kept in refractory wards, with minimal occupation and maximum supervision, which usually makes their conditions worse because boredom and isolation exacerbate mental disturbance. Medical treatment in Victorian asylums is limited. Doctors have few effective interventions for most mental illnesses, so treatment focuses on management rather than cure. The medical superintendent makes rounds daily, observing patients, ordering treatments, and documenting progress, or lack thereof. Physical treatments include cold baths. Plunging agitated patients into cold water supposedly calms them. Sometimes it does, through shock and exhaustion. Sometimes it just traumatizes already disturbed patients. Warm baths. For melancholic patients, long warm baths with head cooled by cold compresses are prescribed for relaxation. Purgatives and emetics. Because Victorian medicine treats mental illness like physical illness, assuming that purging the body helps purge disordered thoughts. Various tonics and sedatives. Bromides for calming, chloral for sleep, morphine for violent patients, and cannabis for various purposes. Yes, really. And physical restraints when all else fails. Straitjackets, leather restraints, or in the worst cases, mechanical chairs that immobilize patients completely. Mainstream fact: the use of restraints was contentious throughout the Victorian period. Moral treatment advocates pushed for non-restraint policies where patients were managed through kindness and occupation rather than physical restraint. Progressive asylums adopted non-restraint and demonstrated it worked. Violent behavior decreased when patients weren't constantly restrained and agitated because they were being ill-treated. But many asylums continued using restraints because they were convenient for understaffed facilities, and staff safety concerns sometimes trumped patient dignity.
Pauper patients, working class admitted at public expense, get large crowded wards, institutional food, minimal personal possessions, limited recreation, infrequent visits, families often can't afford travel, and harsher treatment overall. They're classified as inmates needing control. This class division extends to diagnosis and treatment. A wealthy woman's melancholia might be treated with rest, nutritious food, and gentle occupation. A poor woman's melancholia might be treated with hard work, bland diet, and assumption that she's malingering. Same symptoms, completely different care based on ability to pay. Quirky tidbit: some private asylums resembled country house hotels more than medical facilities. Private grounds, personal servants, fine dining, and entertainment. Wealthy families might confine difficult relatives there for years, essentially paying for comfortable imprisonment disguised as medical care. The medical superintendent might see private patients rarely, while attendants provided daily companionship. This was treatment only in the loosest sense. Asylum staff include The medical superintendent, usually a physician with some psychiatric interest, specialized psychiatric training barely exists yet. He oversees all medical care, manages the institution, and lives on site with his family. His wife often serves as matron, supervising female staff and sometimes female patients. Assistant medical officers, junior doctors who provide day-to-day medical care under superintendent's direction. Attendants, working-class men and women who provide direct patient care, supervising, managing difficult behavior, and implementing treatment orders. They're essentially psychiatric nurses, but without the training, status, or pay of hospital nurses. Trade staff, farmers, cooks, launderers, maintenance workers, many of whom are patients themselves under the occupation therapy system. And chaplains. Every asylum has chapel services because Victorian society assumes religion helps mental health. For some patients it does, for others it's just another institutional requirement to endure. Attendant work is difficult and dangerous. They manage patients who might be violent, unpredictable, or simply deeply distressed. They work long hours for low pay in facilities that are often overcrowded and understaffed. Good attendants develop genuine relationships with patients and provide compassionate care. Bad attendants abuse their power, mistreating vulnerable people who have no recourse. Asylum conditions vary wildly. Progressive asylums like York Retreat or the Quaker Run Retreat continue providing excellent care based on moral treatment principles. Mid-tier county asylums try to balance therapeutic ideals with budget realities, sometimes succeeding, often failing as overcrowding and understaffing undermine good intentions. And the worst asylums, old, overcrowded, understaffed warehouses, essentially function as prisons where mentally ill people are contained but not treated. Overcrowding is chronic. Asylums are designed for specific capacities, say 400 patients, but actually house 600 or 800 because demand always exceeds supply. Corridors become makeshift dormitories, sitting rooms become bedrooms, and therapeutic spaces become storage for excess beds. Staff-to-patient ratios that would be inadequate at design capacity become dangerous with overcrowding. Mainstream fact. By the 1870s and 80s, asylum overcrowding became a recognized crisis. Government inquiries documented appalling conditions, patients sleeping on the floors, minimal supervision allowing violence and neglect, therapeutic programs abandoned due to lack of space and staff. Reform efforts led to building more asylums, which quickly became overcrowded too. The fundamental problem, more people institutionalized than facilities could adequately serve, persisted throughout the Victorian period. Life as an asylum patient means loss of autonomy, dignity, and often hope. You cannot leave. Letters may be censored to protect the asylum's reputation from patient complaints. Visits are supervised. Your possessions are minimal. Institutions fear that personal items might be used for self-harm or violence. Your daily routine is dictated entirely by institutional needs. For some patients, this institutional life is better than what they left. A chaotic family unable to cope, homeless vagrancy, or prison. The asylum provides food, shelter, basic medical care, and some structure. That's genuine improvement over the alternatives, even if the asylum is far from ideal. For others, especially those committed against their will or those whose insanity is actually reasonable response to intolerable situations, the asylum is torture. Imagine being a woman committed for postpartum depression, trapped in an institution where you're separated from your baby, told your maternal feelings are insane symptoms, and kept confined until you learn to express only docile compliance. This happened routinely. The question of wrongful commitment haunted Victorian asylums. Were people committed because they were genuinely mentally ill or because they were inconvenient? Reformers pushed for legal protections, requirements that 2 doctors certify insanity before commitment, regular inspections by commissioners in lunacy, and procedures for patients to appeal their confinement. These protections helped but couldn't prevent all abuses, especially since insanity was subjectively defined and doctors were biased by class and gender assumptions. Quirky tidbit. The Alleged Lunatics Friend Society, founded in 1845, advocated for patients they believed were wrongly confined. They investigated cases, provided legal support, and published reports exposing asylum abuses. Most of their cases involved wealthy people. Wrongful commitment of poor people generated less advocacy. But their work highlighted how easily the label lunatic could be applied to sane people whose families wanted them confined. Treatment outcomes varied. Some patients recovered. Acute illnesses like puerperal insanity or mania following specific stresses might resolve with rest, good food, and time. These success stories were celebrated and featured in annual reports as proof that asylum care worked. Some patients improved to the point they could be discharged, but weren't cured. They returned to communities with ongoing symptoms, but managed them adequately with family support. Asylums theoretically prepared patients for return to community through gradual transition, but resources for follow-up care were minimal. Many patients became chronic. They lived in asylums for years or decades, neither recovering nor deteriorating enough to die quickly. Chronic wards housed people who'd been forgotten by families, who deteriorated under institutional care, or whose conditions were simply untreatable with Victorian medicine. These patients became invisible, living out years in monotonous routine with minimal treatment because resources focused on acute, potentially curable cases.
And some patients died in asylums from their underlying conditions, from physical illnesses exacerbated by institutional life, from suicide, or from accidents. Death rates in asylums were tracked carefully, with medical superintendents defensive about any suggestion their care might be deadly. Inquests investigated suspicious deaths, though investigations often rubber-stamped institutional explanations. Specific conditions were treated differently. General paralysis of the insane, GPI, actually late-stage neurosyphilis, was recognized as progressive and fatal. Patients deteriorated through mania, dementia, paralysis, and death over months or years. Treatment was essentially palliative, keeping patients comfortable as they declined. Your time in the Victorian medical system is coming to an end. Whether you've survived the hospital ward, recovered from surgery, endured treatments, or spent time in the asylum, you've experienced Victorian medicine at its most institutional. You've learned that Victorian hospitals were simultaneously places of healing and harm, where dedicated nurses provided compassionate care, while doctors applied treatments ranging from helpful to horrifying. You've seen how class determined care quality, how medical theory was years ahead of medical practice, and how suffering was considered both unfortunate and somewhat inevitable. The Victorian medical world was transitioning from humoral theory to germ theory, from surgery without anesthesia to surgery without as much dying afterward, from nursing as last resort employment to nursing as respected profession, from asylums as prisons to asylums as sometimes therapeutic institutions. Progress was real but uneven. A patient in 1900 had dramatically better survival chances than in 1850, but still faced risks that would horrify modern people. The Victorian medical establishment was learning, slowly and at tremendous human cost, lessons that would transform into modern medicine. Joke 3. Victorian medicine's greatest achievement was surviving long enough to be replaced by something better. Every treatment failure, every patient lost, every horrific procedure added incrementally to knowledge that eventually produced actual cures. It's just unfortunate that being an incremental data point was so unpleasant for the patients involved. As you leave the hospital or asylum, walking out into Victorian London's foggy streets, you carry with you the experience of surviving Victorian medicine. You've been bled, purged, possibly amputated, definitely underfed, and treated with substances ranging from marginally helpful to actively poisonous. But you survived. And that survival
multiplied by millions of patients across decades, represents the raw data from which modern medicine emerged. The Victorian medical system was brutal, experimental, frequently wrong, and sometimes accidentally right. It treated patients as both precious individuals deserving care and as experimental subjects in an ongoing trial and error process. It combined genuine compassion with casual cruelty, cutting-edge innovation with stubborn tradition, and remarkable progress with tragic waste. And every patient who survived to tell their story contributed to the slow, painful evolution from Victorian medicine to something approaching modern care. So the next time you complain about waiting rooms or hospital food, take a moment to appreciate that you're not lying in a ward with 40 other people, breathing carbolic-scented air, watching the patient next to you cough blood, while a doctor explains that your laudable pus means treatment is progressing nicely, just before prescribing mercury for your fever. Victorian medicine was simultaneously the foundation of modern healthcare and a testament to how much progress was needed. The nurses, doctors, and patients of the Victorian era endured conditions we can barely imagine to build the knowledge base we take for granted. If you've made it this far, thank you for joining me on this journey through Victorian hospital horrors. Drop a comment about which aspect you found most disturbing. I'm guessing all of it will be popular answer. Sleep well, knowing that modern medicine, for all its flaws, is infinitely better than what our Victorian ancestors endured. Until next time, pleasant dreams. Or at least dreams without laudanum, leeches, or amputations performed with confidence but questionable sterility.